Chapter 1, Parts 1 and 2 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Koskinen. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 1, The Beginnings of Greece and the Heroic Age. Section 1, The Origin of the Greeks. Our European civilization had its origin in Greece, and we must date its beginnings to more than 3,000 years ago. We know that in the 13th century B.C. the Greek tongue was spoken throughout the Greek peninsula, and that at the same time, or not much later, Greek minstrels were singing hexameter lays and bringing that marvelous metre to perfection. But when we try to reach further back and to discover whence the Greek-speaking folks came, and how long they had possessed their country, we find little that is certain. In our earliest written record, the Iliad of Homer, the Achaeans appear as the most prominent among the Greek peoples. There are reasons for believing that after the middle of the second millennium, invaders came down from the north, penetrated into the Peloponnesus, and founded or occupied those states which were afterwards glorified in Homeric poems, and that these invaders were the Achaeans. But various opinions may be held as to the significance of this event. It has been supposed that it was in fact the Greek conquest of Greece, that the Achaeans and their fellows were the original people who first spread the Greek tongue over the peninsula, hitherto inhabited by men who spoke no Aryan speech. Or we may hold that men of Greek speech were already in the land, and that the work of the conquerors, whether Greeks themselves or men speaking some other Aryan language, was not to create Greece, but to stimulate her and guide her peoples into new paths. For several reasons it seems probable that the second opinion is true, and that the Achaean invasion is to be compared not to the Anglo-Saxon occupation of Britain, but rather to the Norman conquest. There are no traces of the survival of an older pre-Greek language, and it is difficult to conceive that the conquered population could in a century or two have become, entirely and throughout, Greek like their conquerors. On the other hand, a small body of conquerors entering into possession of a civilization superior to their own might in a short time be assimilated to their subjects. The inhabitants of the hilly uplands of Arcadia boasted that they had lived among their mountains before the birth of the moon. Here there was no Achaean settlements, and if the inhabitants had not been already Greek, Arcadia must have remained, like Wales or Cornwall, a land of alien speech, long after the Achaean conquest. But although we conclude that it had become Greek centuries before the Achaeans appeared on the scene, the Greek peninsula was not always Greek. The original coming of the Greeks was utterly forgotten by their descendants, and we are unable to fix its date. The old home of the invaders is supposed to have lain in the northwest regions of the Balkan Peninsula. They must have come southward in such numbers as to extinguish utterly the native speeches which they found in their new country. The men whom the Greeks conquered learned the new tongue and forgot their own, but they had given to many a hill and rock the name which was to abide with it forever. Corinth and Tiryns, Parnassus and Olympus, Arna and Larissa, are names which the Greeks seem to have received from the ancient inhabitants. And some of these names, which are also found in the western parts of Asia Minor, suggest that the primeval people belonged to a race which was diffused on both sides of the Aegean. We shall not perhaps be far astray if we conjecture that the Greeks descended into Greece in the course of the third millennium. Their conquest may have been a gradual infiltration of people after people, rather than the single migration of a vast host, and may have extended over many years. But by 2000 B.C., Zeus, the great Indo-European Lord of Heaven, was probably invoked throughout the length and breadth of the land. The Greeks of history, who had completely forgotten this far distant past, were not exclusively the descendants of these Greek invaders, for it is not to be supposed that the conquered people was abolished or obliterated. The idea that the older inhabitants were entirely crushed out and a clear field left for the newcomers is due to exactly the same kind of false inference from language to race, which makes out Greeks and Romans, Celts and Germans, Slavs and Illyrians, Phrygians and Armenians, Persians and ancient Indians to be the posterity of common Aryan ancestors, because they all spoke kindred tongues. The Greek language is vigorous and masterful, as its subsequent history has shown. It made a complete conquest of the languages of the older inhabitants. In whatever land the Greeks settled, it became exclusively the language of the land. But the extermination of the older tongues does not mean the extermination of the older races. The men among whom the Greeks settled, or whom they conquered, learned the new tongue and forgot their own. There was fusion of the old and the new, and the Indo-European gods of the invaders had to make terms with the deities of the natives. Section 2. Aegean Civilization. Crete. If Greece, as we may fairly believe, was Greek since days to which we cannot reach back, there flourished close to its shores a great non-Greek civilization, which had a decisive influence on its fortunes, and of which we know far more than of the contemporary Greeks. It is only recently that we have become aware of this Aegean civilization, as it is called, which had grown steadily in Crete and in Melos and other islands of the Aegean, from remote beginnings in the Stone Age, until towards the end of the third millennium Crete entered upon a period of power and brilliancy which rivals in interest the more famous civilizations of Egypt and Babylon. The monuments which reveal the great age of Crete have been dug out of the earth, and although Greek tradition remembered that Crete was once a strong sea power, no one suspected that this island had been the home of a life and art highly developed and various, and the center of a culture which spread far over the Mediterranean Sea. In the course of the third millennium, Crete had passed from the age of stone into the age of metal. The remains of a homogeneous culture have been found all over the island, but the leading settlements, the seats of the most powerful rulers, were Knossos and Phaestus. Nearly at the middle of the north coast, the hill of Knossos is situated a few miles from the sea, close to the banks of a stream, Kairos. Before 2100 B.C., a great palace was erected on this hill, and at Phaestus, in the south of the island, a palatial residence arose much about the same time. These palaces endured for several centuries, and in this period the development of Cretan art was marked by the perfection of polychrome (many-colored) pottery. We have some beautiful examples of what Cretan artists could do, such as a fresco picture of a little boy, who is painted in blue, picking white crocuses and placing them in a vase. The most interesting and important fact about the civilization of the Cretans is that they could write. We find first a method of picture writing, in which each pictorial symbol, such as an ox head, or a gate, or an eye, represented a word. But at a later period there was likewise used a system of linear signs, of which each probably stood for a syllable. A table of drink offerings, inscribed with signs of this kind, was found in the cave of Mount Dicta, already a holy place, and afterwards to be associated with the birth of Zeus. We have no clue to the language of these documents. It seems unlikely that it was Indo-European. It seems most likely that it was cognate with the tongues of the Lycians and other ancient peoples of Western Asia Minor. In Eastern Crete a strange language was still spoken in late times, when the rest of the island had become Greek. We have some slight records of it which can be read, but cannot be interpreted. And it would be natural to suppose that this was the same language which prevailed in the pre-Hellenic period. It was towards the year 1600 B.C. that the end of this period of Cretan history was marked by the partial destruction of the palace of Knossos. Everything points to the conclusion that this was the consequence of a revolution within the island, and not of foreign invasion. Perhaps there was war between Knossos and Phaestus. At all events, the early palace of Phaestus seems to have survived the early palace of Knossos. But a new dynasty was soon to take possession of the Cnossian hill, to develop further the native civilization, and inaugurate a still more brilliant period in the island's history. Aegean civilization attained its highest bloom in Crete, but it had developed independently in the islands of the archipelago, especially in Melos, where its continuous growth can be traced in the important settlement of Philakopi. Melos produces obsidian, which in the Stone Age and later was in great request for the manufacture of knives and spear points, and her export of this product, which was taken for instance to Egypt, may explain her early prosperity. Remains have been found which show that the eastern coast of Greece was not unaffected by this insular civilization. We have still to glance at a great stronghold which towards the end of the third millennium stood on the hill of Troy, commanding the entrance of the Hellespont. It was not the first city that had been reared on that illustrious hill, which rises to the height of about 160 feet, not far from the banks of the Scamander. The earliest settlement, fortified by a rude wall of unwrought stone, can still be traced, and some of its primitive earthenware and stone implements have been found. An axe head of white nephrite seems to show that in those remote days there was a line of traffic, however slow and uncertain, between the Mediterranean and the Far East, for this white jade must have come from Central Asia. On the ruins of this primeval city arose a great fortress, girt with a wall of sun-baked brick, built on strong stone foundations. There were 3 gates, and the angles of the walls were protected by towers. The inhabitants of this city lived in the Stone and Copper Age. Bronze was still a rarity. Their pottery was chiefly handmade, but a treasure of golden ornaments, wrought by skilful craftsmen, shows that the palace was wealthy. The most important feature to be noted is the outline of the palace in this ancient city. Here, at the very outset of Aegean civilization, we find the general plan of the main part of the house exactly the same as that which is described, more than 1,000 years later, in the poems of Homer. From an outer gate we pass through a courtyard, in which an altar stood, into a square preliminary chamber, and from it we enter the great hall, in the centre of which was the hearth. An enemy's hand destroyed the castle by fire, and no tradition of its existence has survived. When we come down 7 or 8 centuries to the famous city of which it was the precursor, we shall learn the probable secret of the prosperity of its kings. It may be asked how, without the guidance of literary records, we can fix the successive stages of Aegean civilization in an ordered series, and assign approximate dates to its periods. When we have started with the capital division of time, between the Age of Stone and the Age of Bronze, the potter's art is the chief clue for establishing a relative chronology within each of these ages. The clay vessels, from the most simple and primitive moulded by hand, to the most artistic and elaborate wrought by wheel, can be arranged in a definite series, and thus the things which are found in the same stratum as a particular class of sherds can be assigned to a definite place in this succession. Such things, found in association with particular stages in the development of pottery, may then become themselves additional criteria for dating remains. The history of Cretan civilization from the end of the Stone Age has by this means been arranged in three chief ages, called Early, Middle, and Late Minoan, and each of these has been subdivided into three periods. It is to the intercourse of Crete with Egypt that we are indebted for the means of determining roughly the absolute dates of its history, or, in other words, of correlating its chronology with the general chronology of the world. Thus, a polychrome Cretan vessel found in the tomb of King Senusert III, Sesostris, at Egyptian Abydos enables us to conclude that the second period of the Middle Minoan Age was approaching its close about B.C. 1880. Again, the statuette of an Egyptian in diorite stone, inscribed with his name in Egyptian characters, was found in a court of the Cnossian Palace, and its style makes it probable that it was wrought under the 12th or 13th dynasty, perhaps in the second half of the 19th century B.C. It was probably about 1600 B.C. that kings, perhaps of a new dynasty but not of a new race, began to rule on the hill of Knossos. The palace had been rebuilt on a grander scale, and adapted to more sumptuous needs, though there was no change in the general architectural style, and about 1500 B.C. it seems to have been extensively remodelled. It covered an area of about 5 acres. It was not fortified by an exterior wall. Its lords seem to have trusted to their ships for defence against foreign invaders. To the east and to the west of a great central court were extensive labyrinths of rooms and passages, and the remains of staircases show that in some parts the building rose to the height of 3 or 4 stories. The principal halls were lit at one end by open shafts or light wells, walled in on 3 sides, and on the 4th open to the hall from which they were separated by 2 or 3 columns. There were bathrooms, and there was an excellent system of drainage by pipes, superior perhaps to any of the contrivances that have been since in use till quite recent times. If the palace had merely served as the habitation of the royal household, it need not have been so large. But it was much more. It was the seat of a government which controlled not merely the neighbouring regions or even the island, but a maritime empire. The administration of this empire was conducted on careful business lines, as is shown by the financial documents found in the archives. We may fairly surmise that there existed a well-developed system of administrative machinery which needed considerable room for its offices. The rich tributes which the kings derived from their dependencies were stored in the palace, and various industries were carried on within its walls for the private needs of the monarch, and also probably for purposes of commerce. The discovery of an olive press and great jars for oil storage suggests that not only did the palace supply itself with the oil required for its cooking and its lamp fuel, but that the king himself may have traded in oil, which seems at this time to have been one of the principal Cretan exports. Then there was accommodation for the sculptors and painters who were employed in the royal service. There is evidence that the paints were manufactured on the spot, and a sculptor's workshop has been discovered. One of the most notable rooms in this spacious palace was the Chamber of the Throne, entered through an anteroom from the central court. The throne is a stone seat adorned with a painted design, and on either side are benches along the wall. Here the king may have sat in council with his ministers. Adjoining this apartment was a room open to the air, containing a tank, and its walls showed a picture of Egyptian character, a landscape with river, sedge, and palms. Most of the principal chambers and corridors were decorated with fresco paintings, representing solemn processions, gay groups of men and women, scenes of town life, less often of war. The fashions of the time are vividly portrayed in a series of miniature frescoes, showing us women, idling in courts or on balconies, with their hair elaborately dressed, wearing costumes which look as if they had been modelled on quite modern fashions: puffed sleeves, flounced skirts, bodices tightly drawn in round the waist. One of the most striking pictures which have survived is that of a tall, handsome cup-bearer, evidently belonging to the same race as the Cretans, Keftiu, who are represented in a painting of Egyptian Thebes as bringing offerings to King Thothmes III in the 15th century. Near the northern entrance to their palace the later lords of Knossos constructed a theatre capable of holding about 400 spectators. This was not a new thing. A theatre of an earlier period has been discovered in the palace of Phaestus. The orchestral area in these early theatres was not circular, as in those of later times, but rectangular, and the performances were probably religious dances in honor of the great Cretan goddess, and perhaps boxing matches. The space was not large enough for bullfights, which seem to have been a favorite amusement of the Cretans, if we may judge from scenes depicted on wall paintings and gems, which present acrobats grappling with bulls. Women took part in this dangerous sport. In one painting we see a girl in the air caught on the horns of a bull. The kings had also quieter recreations. A magnificent inlaid gaming board of very beautiful design was found in the palace, made of pieces of ivory overlaid with gold foil, and crystals coloured alternately blue and white by means of blue paste (kyanos) and silver foil, on which they were set. Beneath the great palace, close to the river bank and about 130 yards east of the northern entrance gate, was a smaller palace which, it has been conjectured, may have been used by the king as a summer retreat. On its smaller scale it seems to have been as sumptuous as the greater dwelling. Here was found, fallen from a room on an upper story, a superb painted jar, showing the highest point to which the art of the Cnossian potters could attain in the 16th century. The decoration, displaying sprays of papyrus and rosettes, is effected by the combination of colour and relief. Here, too, there was a throne room, a remarkable pillared hall, more than 12 yards long, resembling in its arrangement the Roman basilica or law court. The rebuilding of the palace of Phaestus fell perhaps in the 16th century. Like that of Knossos, it was unfortified, and it was built on a very similar plan, and in the same fashion of architecture. Here, too, there was a large court in the centre, surrounded by pillared reception halls and storerooms, and a smaller court in the west of the building. The residence of Phaestus was distinguished by an imposing entrance, with a flight of 12 steps, 45 feet broad, and though it was much smaller in extent than the rival palace of Knossos, and its walls were not adorned with such rich and various paintings, its external appearance seems to have been more imposing, for it was built upon the slope of a hill, and rose, roof above roof, on different levels. About 2 miles off, at a place now called Hagia Triada, a well-built house has been found which seems to have served as a pleasure residence for the potentates of the neighbouring palace. Not far from the palace of Knossos there must have been a populous town. Whole Cretan towns have been excavated in eastern Crete, and much has been found to illustrate the town life of the common people and the artisans. For instance, the house of a carpenter, with all his tools, his chisels, saws, awls, and nails. But of the appearance of a flourishing town, such as Knossos must have been, we can better gain an idea from the facades of private houses which are represented on mosaic plaques of porcelain discovered in the palace. The houses were of several stories. Some had 2 doors, others 1. The windows above might have 4 or 6 panes, and there seemed to be unwindowed openings in the upper stories, which might serve the purposes of balconies. These Cretan houses show considerable likeness to contemporary houses in Egypt. There seems to be no evidence that there were public temples in Crete at this period. There were sanctuaries in the palaces, and perhaps the Cretans generally performed their religious duties in domestic shrines. The chief divinity whom they worshipped was a nature goddess, the goddess whom the Greeks called Rhea, and this indeed may have been her Cretan name. Scenes of worship were frequently depicted in art. The goddess is represented sometimes guarded by lions, sometimes associated with doves who were symbolic of the descent of a deity. She was served by priestesses. She was closely connected with a male divinity, whether her consort or her son, who seems to have been subordinate to her. In later times the Greeks conceived this god as Zeus, son of Rhea, and nurtured in the Aegean cave. Both the goddess and the god were associated with the double axe, a fetish in which the deity was supposed to dwell. We find the same worship of the double axe in Western Asia Minor among the Carians. This symbol was so frequently represented on the walls of the Cnossian palace that it might almost be called the Palace of the Double Axe, and as the Carian name for the double axe was Labris, it has been suggested that the palace was known as the Labyrinthos. This would explain the origin of the curious Greek legend that Minos, king of Knossos, kept in a labyrinth the monstrous Minotaur, who devoured the tribute of youths and virgins brought from overseas. The intricate plan of the palace might well suggest a maze. We have seen that the art of writing was long familiar to the Cretans. In this later period a new and more advanced system of linear signs was in use. The kings kept accurate records and accounts. Hundreds of written documents have been found in the Cnossian palace, consisting of small rectangular tablets of clay, which were preserved in wooden boxes secured by seals. As we have no clue to the language, they cannot be read, but the numerical symbols can be identified. The arithmetical system was decimal, and there were signs for fractions. It has been inferred from the frequent occurrence of numerals and from the insertion of figures representing objects, that many of the documents are accounts relating to the stores. The Cretans possessed a system of weights, and here they seem to have been indebted, through whatever intermediate channel, to the kingdom of Babylonia, for their standard was derived from what is known as the light Babylonian talent. And they had a metal currency. Pieces of gold and silver and bronze ingots have been found, which can only have been used for the purpose of exchange. The power and splendor of the kings of Knossos were at their height in the 15th century. These kings were undoubtedly the richest and most powerful in Crete, and it is not improbable that they now exercised overlordship over the rulers of Phaestus and over the other towns of the island, in many of which striking remains of Aegean civilization have been unearthed. Their fleets controlled the Aegean Sea. They dominated the islands, and their civilization spread, as we shall see, to the mainland of Greece. But Cretan influence radiated to more distant shores, by trade and even by colonization. The commercial intercourse with Egypt, which had existed from primitive times, became probably more regular and frequent. Oil and pottery were exported to the lands of the Nile. The kings of the country of the Keftiu and the Isles of the Great Sea brought offerings to the great monarchs of the 18th dynasty, and the influence of Egypt can be traced in the Cretan culture of the time. The Philistines, who settled in southern Palestine, are now supposed to have been colonists from Crete, and remains found in Sicily and Spain testify that the island of Minos sent products and offshoots of its civilization far to the west. The later Greeks associated the Cretan supremacy in the Aegean with the name of the great sea lord, Minos. The most ancient tradition seems to have known two kings of this name, of whom one reigned towards the end of the 15th century, and the other about 200 years later. The earlier was confused and blended with the later figure, and in consequence of this confusion, the false belief arose that the Cretan thalassocracy was at its height towards the close of the 13th century. End of Chapter 1, Part 2.
Chapter 1, Part 3 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leon Meyer. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnall Berry. Chapter 1, Part 3. Mycenaean Civilization, 1600 to 1100 BC. The rise of a civilization on Greek soil, very similar to Cretan and undoubtedly under Cretan influence, began probably in the 16th century and lasted till the end of the 12th. Its records are monuments of stone which have remained for more than 3,000 years above the face of the earth, or have been brought to light by the spade, and the objects of daily use and luxury which are placed in the houses of the dead, and have been unearthed, chiefly in our days, by the curiosity of Europeans seeking the origins of their own civilization. And for the later stage of this period we have the Homeric poems. The most numerous and significant records have been found in the east of the Peloponnesus and the plain of Argos, at Mycenae, which keeps guard in the mountains at the northern end of the plain, and at Tiryns, its lowlier fellow close to the sea. The richest and strongest city on the coast of the Aegean seems for a long time to have been Mycenae. The memory of its wealth survived in the epithet golden, which distinguishes it in the Homeric poems. For want of an exact term, the whole civilization to which Mycenae's greatness belongs has been called Mycenaean. Tiryns was the older of the two fortresses, and had played its part in the earlier epoch before the Aegean peoples had yet emerged from the Stone Age. It stands on a long low rock about 1.5 miles from the sea, and the land around it was once a marsh. From north to south the hill rises in height and was shaped by man's hand into 3 platforms, of which the southern and highest was occupied by the palace of the king. But the whole Acropolis was strongly walled round by a structure of massive stones, laid in regular layers but rudely dressed, the crevices being filled with a mortar of clay. This fashion of building has been called Cyclopean, from the legend that masons called Cyclopes were invited from Lycia to build the walls of Tiryns. The main gate of entrance, on the east side, was approached by a passage between the outer wall of the fortress and the wall of the palace. And the right, unshielded side of an enemy advancing to the gate was exposed to the defenders on the castle wall. On the west side there was a postern, from which a long flight of stone steps led up to the back part of the palace. But one curious feature in the castle of Tiryns sets it apart from all the other ancient fortresses of Greece. On the south side the wall deepens for the purpose of containing store chambers, the doors of which open out upon covered galleries, also built inside the wall, and furnished with windows looking outward. The stronghold of Mycenae, about 12 miles inland, at the northeastern end of the Argive plain, was built on a hill which rises to 900 feet above the sea level in a mountain glen. The shape of the citadel is a triangle, and the greater part of the wall is built in the same Cyclopean style as the wall of Tiryns, but of smaller stones. Another fashion of architecture, however, also occurs, and points to a later date than Tiryns. The gates and some of the towers are built of even layers of stone carefully hewn into rectangular shape. No storerooms or galleries like those of Tyrants have been found at Mycenae, but on the northeast side a vaulted stone passage in the wall led by a downward subterranean path to the foot of the hill, where a cistern was supplied from a perennial spring outside the walls. Thus the garrison was furnished with water in case of a siege. Mycenae had two gates. The chief was on the west, ensconced in a corner of the wall, which at this point, running in southeastward, then turned outward due west, and thus enclosed and commanded the approach to the gate. The lintel of the doorway is formed by one huge square block of stone, and the weight of the wall resting on it is lightened by the device of leaving a triangular space. This opening is filled by a sculptured stone relief representing two lionesses standing opposite each other on either side of a pillar, on whose pedestal their forepaws rest. They are, as it were, watchers who ward the castle, and from them the gate is known as the Lion Gate. The ruins on the hill of Tyrants enable us to trace the plan of the palace of its kings. One chief principle of the construction of the palaces of this age seems to have been the separation of the dwelling house of the women from that of the men, a principle which continued to prevail in Greek domestic architecture in historical times. But the striking characteristic of Tyrants is that while the halls of the king and the halls of the queen are built side by side in the center of the palace, there is no direct communication between them, and they have different approaches. The halls of king and queen alike are built on the same general plan as the palace in the old brick city on the hill of Troy, and the palaces which are described in the poems of Homer. An altar stood in the men's courtyard, which was enclosed by pillared porticos, the portico which faced the gate being the vestibule of the house. Double-leafed doors opened from the vestibule into a preliminary hall, from which one passed through a curtained doorway over a great stone threshold into the men's hall. In the midst of it was the round hearth, the center of the house, encircled by 4 wooden pillars which supported the flat roof. The palace of Mycenae crowned the highest part of the hill, and its plan, though it cannot be traced so clearly or fully, was in general conception and in many details alike. The hearth, of which part remains, was ornamented by spiral and triangular patterns in red, blue, and white. The floors of the covered rooms were made of fine cement, and in the open courts the cement was hardened by small pebbles. Sometimes the floors are brightened with colored patterns. It was customary to embellish the walls by inlet sculptured friezes and by paintings. A brilliant alabaster frieze, inset with cyanus or paste of blue glass, decorated the vestibule of the hall at Tyrants, and the men's halls in both palaces were adorned with mural pictures. The design and structure of these palaces differ in some notable respects from those of Crete. They were protected by strong exterior walls, while Knossos and Phaestus had no such fortifications. In the milder climate of Crete, portable braziers were sufficient for heating the rooms, and the architects could plan their houses without having to make holes in the roof for smoke to escape, whereas the severer weather of Greece rendered a fixed hearth necessary in the center of the chief hall, with a vent above for the smoke. This hall, with its pillared portico, became the most important part of the palace, and it was lit from above. The light wells, characteristic of Knossos and Phaestus, were not used in the castles of the mainland. Besides their castle and palace, the burying places of the kings of Mycenae are their most striking memorials. The men with whom we are now dealing bestowed their dead in tombs. There is no trace of the practice of burning corpses. At one time the lords of the citadel and their families were buried on the castle hill. Close to the western wall, south of the Lion Gate, the royal burial circle has been discovered, within which 6 tombs cut vertically into the rock had remained untouched by the hand of man since the last corpses were placed in them. Weapons were buried with the men, some of whose faces were covered with gold masks. The heads of the women were decked with gold diadems. Rich ornaments and things of household use were placed beside them. There was a stele or sepulchral stone over each tomb, and some of these slabs were sculptured. But a day came when this simple kind of grave was no longer royal enough for the rich princes of Mycenae, and they sought more imposing resting places, or else, as some believe, they were overthrown by lords of another race who brought with them a new fashion of sepulchre. 9 sepulchral domes, hewn in the opposite hillside, have been found not far from the Acropolis. The largest of them is generally known as the Treasury of Atreus, a name which arose from a false idea as to its purpose. These tombs, which are found, as we shall see, in other places in Greece, consist of 3 parts: the passage of approach, the portal, and the dome. A stone causeway leads up to the portal, which admits into a round vaulted chamber, built into the hollowed slope of a hill, and in some tombs, but this is exceptional, there is also a square side chamber. The portal of the Treasury of Atreus had a striking facade, being clad with slabs of coloured marble and framed by dark grey alabaster pillars with zigzag and spiral patterns and carved capitals. The 2 massive lintel stones were relieved by the same device which was adopted in the architecture of the Lion Gate, and the triangle was filled by red porphyry. The vaulted room, of beehive shape, is formed by rings of well-joined and well-chiselled stones which grow narrower as they rise, and a roof stone. The walls were adorned with bronze rosettes arranged in some pattern. A door, similar to that of the portal and framed with pillars, admits to the side chamber, which is hewn into the rock. Its walls were decorated with sculptured alabaster plates. The doorway of another tomb was framed by 2 alabaster columns, fluted like the columns of a Doric temple. But besides the stately burying places of the kings, the humbler tombs of the people have been discovered. The town of Mycenae, below the citadel, consisted of a group of villages, each of which preserved its separate identity. Each had its own burying ground. Thus Mycenae, and probably other towns of the age, represented an intermediate stage between the village and the city, a number of little communities gathered together in one place, and dominated by a fortress. The tombs in these village burying grounds resemble in plan the royal vaults. They are square chambers cut into the rock. They are approached by a passage which leads up to a doorway. The difference is that they are not round and have gabled roofs. Some of the things found in these sepulchres indicate that most of them are of later date than the royal tombs of the citadel and contemporary with the vaulted tombs below. We have seen how in the royal graves on the castle hill treasures of gold, long hidden from the light of day, revealed the wealth of the Mycenaean kingdom. Treasures would perhaps have been found also in some of the great vaulted tombs if they had not been rifled by plunderers in subsequent ages. But for us the works of the potter, and the implements of war and peace fashioned by the bronze smith, are of more value than the golden ornaments for studying this early civilization, and things of daily use have been found in the lowlier rock tombs as well as in the royal sepulchres of hill or plain. From the implements which the people used, and also from the representations which artists wrought, we can win a rough picture of their dress, armor, and ornaments, and form an idea of their capacity in art. Their civilization belonged to the age of bronze and copper. Even in its later period, iron was still so rare and costly that it was only used for ornaments, rings for instance, and possibly for money. And in its earlier period, the Stone Age had not quite been forgotten. Obsidian was still employed for the heads of arrows. But in general, bronze was used in Greece for all implements throughout this age. The arms with which the men of Mycenae attacked their foes were sword, spear, and bow. Their defensive armor consisted of huge helmets, probably made of leather, shields of oxhide reaching from the neck almost to the feet, complete towers of defense, but so clumsy that it was the chief part of a military education to manage them. The princes went forth to war in 2-horsed war chariots, which consisted of a board to stand on and a breastwork of wicker. The fragment of a silver vessel, found in one of the rock tombs of Mycenae, shows us a scene of battle in front of the walls of a mountain city, from whose battlements women, watching the fight, are waving their hands. Round shields came into use later. Among the pottery discovered at Mycenae there was a large jar, on one side of which we see a woman looking after 6 warriors with round shields, marching forth to battle armed from head to foot, and on the other, less clearly, men engaged in battle, black-brown figures on a yellow ground. On gems and seal stones we also find representations of armed men. One of the most striking pictures of the warriors of this age is a group of 5 spearmen with round shields on a painted gravestone. Men wore long hair, not however flowing freely, but tied or plaited in tresses. Razors have been found in the tombs, but in contrast with the Cretans, who always shaved, they often let the beard grow. It is not certain that they ever went naked with mere loin aprons like the Cretans. In later times they wore a close-fitting tunic and a cloak fastened by a clasp pin. High-born dames wore tight bodices and wide gown skirts. Frontlets, or bands around the brow, were a distinction of their attire, and they wore their hair high, coiled in rings, letting the ends fall behind. The ornaments which have been found in the royal tombs show that the queens of Mycenae appeared in glittering gold array. The Mycenaean pottery has given a clue for fixing the earlier and later epochs of the civilization which produced it, and enables us to say that, for instance, the vaulted sepulchres of the plain were subsequent to the shaft sepulchres on the castle hill of Mycenae. The painted vessels of the second millennium fall into 2 general classes, unglazed and glazed. The unglazed, ornamented chiefly with lines and spirals, were older, and when the glazed style attained its perfection, went almost entirely out of use. In the varnished jars, the development of the handicraft from the cruder work of the earlier potters can be traced through the best period into an age of decadence, when the Mycenaean comes into competition with other and newer styles. The color of these vessels in the best age is warm, varying from yellow to dark brown, and sometimes burnt into a rich deep red. A new impulse of decoration has come upon the potters. The ornaments are no longer lines and spirals, but vegetables and animals, especially of the sea kingdom, fishes, polypods, seaweeds. On the other hand, sphinxes, griffins, lotus flowers, and other Oriental and Egyptian subjects, though common elsewhere in Mycenaean ornament, are hardly ever copied by the workers in clay. The curious false-necked jars, which have no opening above the neck, but a spout at the side, are one of the most characteristic products of the potteries which we call Mycenaean. Other marks for fixing the relative dates of Mycenaean troves are stone tools and iron. If, for example, we find in one tomb obsidian spearheads and no trace of iron, and in another no stone implements but iron rings, it is a safe inference that the first is older than the second. The occurrence of iron is a mark of comparative lateness. It is by such marks as these that we are able to say that the kings of the shaft graves reigned before the kings who were buried in the vaulted tombs, and that remains which have been found in the island of Thura belong to the beginning of the Mycenaean age. The remains at Mycenae and Tiryns are, taken in their entirety, the most impressive of the memorials of the civilization of the Greek mainland in the Bronze Age. Close to Sparta, on high ground on the east bank of the Eurotas, there was an unwalled stronghold which perished in a conflagration, and in later times was associated with the name of King Menelaus. And not too far to the south, at Amyclae, which was in early ages perhaps the most important place in the Laconian Vale, there has been discovered a lordly tomb, which, unlike the treasury of Atreus, was never invaded by robbers. In this vault, among other costly treasures, were found the most precious of all the works of Cretan art that have yet been drawn forth from the earth: 2 golden cups on which a metalworker of matchless skill has wrought vivid scenes of the snaring and capturing of wild bulls. In Attica there are many relics. On the Athenian Acropolis there are a few stones supposed to belong to a palace of great antiquity, but we can look with more certainty on some of the ancient foundations of the fortress wall. This wall was called Pelargic or Pelasgic by the Athenians, and it seems likely that the word preserves the name of the ancient inhabitants of the place, the Pelasgoi. But the Pelasgians of Athens were not the only people of the Athenian plain. Towards the north end of this plain, a vaulted tomb seems to record ancient princes of Acharni. The lords of Thoricus had tombs of the same fashion, and at Eleusis there is similar evidence. In many other places in Attica, graves of this period have been found. At Persei, a number of remarkable rock tombs resembling those in the lower town of Mycenae. In Boeotia there are some striking memorials. Remains of a palace, with some traces of wall paintings, have been found on Cadmea, the citadel of historic Thebes. On the western shores of the great Copaic marsh a people dwelled whose wealth was proverbial, and their city, Orchomenus, shared with Mycenae the attribute of golden in the Homeric poems. Paintings on the walls of their palace represented scenes from the sports of the bull ring, and pillar shrines, which must have been executed by artists of the same school as those who wrought at Knossos. One of their kings built a great sepulchral vault under the hill of the citadel, and later generations took it for a treasury. It approached, though it did not quite attain to, the size of the treasure house of Atreus itself, and it had a second chamber covered by a stone ceiling, which was adorned with a curious design in low relief, an arrangement of meandering spirals and fan-shaped leaves bordered by rosettes, producing the effect of a carpet. The same design which decked the burying place of Orchomenus in stone was used by the painters of some lord of Tiryns to adorn the walls of his palace, and one is tempted to see both in the ceiling and in the sepulchre the work of craftsmen from Crete. But in any case, the common design of ceiling and painting is borrowed from Egypt, for we find almost the same design on the ceilings of tombs at Egyptian Thebes. The lords of Orchomenus were probably the mightiest lords in Boeotia, but they had neighbours, were they rivals or friends, in another fastness of the Copaic marsh. While Orchomenus was situated by the western shores, this primeval stronghold was built on a rock rising out of the waters. The ruins of the mighty fortress walls which girded the edge of the rock are still there, and the foundations of the palace of these island princes, but the name of the place is unknown. To the lords of this nameless castle, and to the princes of Orchomenus, the curious habits of their spacious lake were a matter of perpetual concern. The lake or morass which fertilized their land has no river to bear its water to the sea, and its only outlets are underground clefts piercing Mount Toon, which rises on its northern banks, a barrier between the lake and the sea. To help the water to reach these passages, men made canals through the lake, and guarded them by fortresses. Remains have also been found, especially at Pylos and in Leucas and Cephallenia, which show that the coasts and islands of the Ionian Sea, which in Homeric poetry are associated with Nestor and Odysseus, were not outside the Mycenaean circle. At the extreme southwest of the Aegean there was a Mycenaean community at the beginning of the 14th century, at Ialysus and Rhodes. An old burying place has been dug out, and revealed horizontal rock graves with the arrangement of avenue, doorway, and four-sided chamber, resembling those of Mycenae. The vases found here belong to the best kind of Mycenaean glazed ware, and the absence of earlier pottery suggests that this stage of civilization had not been reached by a gradual development in the place, but that settlers had brought their civilization with them. In Thessaly, the rude life of the Stone Age survived long after Cretan civilization had transformed southern Greece. The land remained comparatively barbarous, and even when, in the late Aegean period, the civilization of the south began to penetrate, it never throve. Thessaly can show no wealthy cities or mighty walls. A few small beehive tombs are the chief record of the heroic age. From this brief survey of the character and range of the Mycenaean civilization, it will be seen that it was an outgrowth of Cretan civilization, marked by peculiarities of its own. The period within which it flourished and declined fell between the 16th and the 11th centuries. The end came with the beginning of the Iron Age, and in Greece iron did not come into general use for weapons and ordinary purposes before the 11th century. Here too, as in Crete, Egypt supplies evidence bearing on the chronology. Early in the 16th century, Mycenaean vases were represented on a wall painting at Egyptian Thebes. At Gurab, a city which was built in the 15th century and destroyed 200 or 300 years later, a number of false neck jars imported from the Aegean have been found, and they belong not to the earlier but to the later period of Mycenaean pottery. And Egyptian evidence is found not only on Egyptian soil, but on both sides of the Aegean. 3 pieces of porcelain, one inscribed with a name, the 2 others with the cartouche of Amenhotep III of Egypt, and a scarab with the name of his wife, Taia, have been found in the chamber tombs of Mycenae. It is a curious coincidence that a scarab of the same Amenhotep was discovered in the burying place of Ialus in Rhodes. The single occurrence of such a scarab in one place might be an unsafe basis for an argument, but the coincidence seems to point to some special epoch of active intercourse with Egypt in this king's reign. It would follow that, early in the 14th century at latest, the period of the chamber tombs and the vaulted tombs began, but the earlier sepulchres also supply testimony to Egyptian influence. On an inlaid dagger blade found in one of the rock tombs on the Mycenaean citadel, we see represented a scene from Egyptian life, ichneumons catching ducks in a river which can only be the Nile. The workmanship is Aegean, not Egyptian, but the Aegean artist knew Egypt. The simplest way of explaining the rise of this civilization is to suppose that the Cretans, when their power expanded after 1600 BC, descended on various parts of eastern Greece, and, establishing themselves especially in Argolis and Boeotia, planted their own culture among the Greeks. There is some evidence for Cretan settlements and Cretan lordships. For instance, the name of the island Manoa, opposite to Megara, seems to record its settlement from the island of Minos. In the legend of Cadmus and Europa, the founders of Thebes, Europa is the mother of Minos, daughter of Phoenix, and the tradition that Cadmus was the inventor of writing may commemorate the introduction of a Cretan script. Though the story represents Europa as a Phoenician, she was in the original version a Cretan princess. As the daughter of Phoenix, she was transferred to Phoenicia because the Greeks had forgotten that, long before they were acquainted with the traders of Tyre and Sidon, they had been wont to designate the brown-skinned Cretans as Phoenices, red men. The name of the hero Phoenix, whom we meet in Homer, may be explained by supposing that he descended from Cretan settlers in northern Greece. Probably some of the principalities which were founded under the aegis of Crete grew strong enough to fling off the authority of the Minoan sovereigns and refuse to pay tribute. But in all that concerns the relations of Knossos to Mycenae and her fellows, the history of the 15th century is hidden from us. Then, about 1400 BC, Knossos fell and the glory of Crete departed. The splendid palace was destroyed by fire, and the other great settlements in the island seem to have been overwhelmed in the same catastrophe. This common destruction seems to show that the disaster was the work of invaders, and of invaders who had come simply to destroy and to sail away when the work of ruin was complete. But who the destroyers were we cannot say for certain. Some think that they were the Achaeans, who, as we shall see, rose to great power in Greece in the 13th century and also made settlements and bore rule in Crete. But although it is not impossible that the Achaeans may have left their northern homes in the regions of the Danube and reached North Greece in the 15th century, there is no convincing evidence that their coming was so early. No new palaces arose at Knossos and Phaestus. The old civilization was left to live on and decline. The site of Knossos was reoccupied, but its reoccupation does not suggest the abode of new conquerors. It is not impossible that the ruin of the Cretan power was wrought by the lords of the Argolid plain, who had become rivals of the Gnossian kings. At all events, after the fall of Knossos, pre-Achaean Argolis became the most powerful seat of Aegean civilization. We can make out little as to the mutual relations of the small kingdoms of the prehistoric Greek world. The eminent position of golden Mycenae herself seems to be established. Her comparative wealth is indicated by the treasures of her tombs which exceed all treasures found elsewhere in the Aegean. But her lords were not only rich, their power stretched beyond their immediate territory. This fact may be inferred from the road system which connected Mycenae with Corinth, and must have been constructed by one of her kings. 3 narrow but stoutly built highways have been traced, the 2 western joining at Cleone, the eastern going by Tinea. They rest on substructions of Cyclopean masonry. Streams are bridged and rocks are hewn through, and as they were not wide enough for wagons, the wares of Mycenae were probably carried to the isthmus on the backs of mules. If the glazed clayware, so abundantly found at Mycenae, was wrought there, and not, as some think, imported from the islands, then the industry of her potteries may have been a source of her wealth. It is not easy to determine whether Mycenae held sway over the whole Argive plain, and especially what was her relation to Tiryns. A road leading southward as far as a small hill, which was in later times famous for a great temple of Hera, may show that this site was under the dominion of Mycenae, and it was a place of some importance, for 3 vaulted hill tombs have been found hard by. Tiryns was an older place of habitation than Mycenae, and it has been suggested that it may have been Terinthian kings who first selected the Mycenaean hill as a strong post at the head of the plain and a bulwark against invaders from the north. Argos itself, under the hill of Larissa, must have been a place of importance, and in the 13th century Tiryns seems not to have belonged to Mycenae, but to the lords of Argos. Of the power and resources of the Aegean states, the monuments hardly enable us to form an absolute idea. They were small. It was an age when men might cross a kingdom in a day. The kings had slaves to toil for them. The fortresses and the large tombs were assuredly built by the hands of thralls. One fact shows in a striking way how small were these kingdoms, and how slender their means, compared with the powerful realms of Egypt and the Orient. If Babylonian or Egyptian monarchs, with their command of slave labor, had ruled in Greece, they would assuredly have cut a canal across the isthmus and promoted facilities for commerce by joining the eastern with the western sea. That was an undertaking which neither the small primitive states nor the Greek states which came after ever had the means of carrying out. End of Chapter 1, Section 3. Chapter 1, Parts 4 through 6 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leon Meyer. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 1, Part 4. The Achaeans and the Trojan War. It is uncertain at what time the Achaeans made their first appearance in the Greek peninsula. They were a people of blonde complexion, of Indo-European speech, who came down from the regions of the Danube and made conquests in Thessaly and the plain of the Spercheius. In the course of time some of their chieftains won lordships in the Peloponnesus, in Argolis and Laconia, probably by marriages with daughters of the old Greek dynasties. It is not probable that the Achaean invaders came in great numbers. They formed a small ruling class who were soon assimilated in speech and manners to their Greek subjects. They did not work destruction. They won lordship and leadership, and their adventurous spirit guided Greece to great enterprises. They carried on the traditions of the civilization which they found. In Thessaly, poor and backward; in the Peloponnesus, wealthy and luxurious. In the later remains of Mycenaean civilization, their presence or influence can be recognized by some new features which they brought with them from the north, such as the use of long swords, round shields, and brooches. They also introduced the practice of burning the dead. Some think it was these northern invaders who destroyed the palaces of Knossos and Phaestus. In that case we must suppose that before B.C. 1400 they had settled in Thessaly. But we can only be certain that by the 13th century they had both risen to power in Argos and made settlements in Crete. The dynasty from which the Homeric kings, Agamemnon and Menelaus, sprang was founded, according to Greek tradition, early in the 13th century by Pelops, a Phrygian. Agamemnon and Menelaus represent the Achaean stock, and the meaning of this Phrygian relationship is not clear. At whatever time they came, the Achaeans had become true Greeks, and were the most prominent among Greek rulers in the 13th and 12th centuries, and the kings who held sway in Argolis were the most powerful. It is significant that the minstrels of the 12th century used both Achaeans and Argives to designate all the Greeks. They used also in the same sense the obscure name Danaoi, which legend associated especially with the Argolid, and which perhaps belonged to the original Greek inhabitants of that district. The Achaeans of northern Greece, of the land which was later to be Thessaly, seem to have been the great sea adventurers of the heroic age. With this country were connected the memories of early Greek exploration of the Euxine, in the legend of the ship Argo. And to the Achaeans of Thessaly we must probably refer the earliest notice which preserves the Achaean name in a historical document. An Egyptian writing tells us that they came in company with other peoples from the lands of the sea, and invaded Egypt in the year 1229 B.C., when Merneptah was king. But the great achievement which made the Achaeans illustrious was one in which southern and northern Greece combined, the expedition against Troy. The Achaean name is specially associated with the land of Phthia in southern Thessaly, and the country to the south, including the plain of the river Spercheius, as far as Mount Oeta. The Spercheius region has a particular interest as the original land of Hellas. Here dwelled the Hellenes, a small folk, who would one day give their name to all the Greeks. They were probably the old Greek population who had been subdued by the Achaean invaders. If we may judge from the ancient names of places which the Greeks preserved, it would seem that languages closely akin were at one time spoken on both sides of the Aegean and in the Isles. The coastmen and highlanders of western Asia Minor called their capes and hills and streams by names which resemble in root and formation names which we find on the coast and in the highlands of Greece, and in islands of the intermediate sea. But the strange thing is that the diffusion of the civilization which we have been examining stopped short at the margin of the Asiatic shore. It extended to Rhodes and to small islands north and south of Rhodes, but it did not, until the days of its decline, touch the opposite continent. The people who held the seaboard of Asia Minor, between the Troad in the north and Lycia in the south, were the Meonians, the Carians, and the Leleges. It is a fact of importance that these lands lay outside the Mycenaean world, notwithstanding the affinities of race which bound the inhabitants of those countries to the folks of the Aegean islands and Greece. South of Troy, which stood quite by itself, there are no palaces or fortresses of the Mycenaean age along the East Aegean coast, nor in the large islands of Lesbos, Chios, and Samos. The relics even of commerce with the western Aegean, though one would expect such commerce to have been brisk and constant, are few and rare. There was, therefore, an obstinate resistance on the part of the inhabitants of these regions to the reception of the Aegean civilization of the Bronze Age. The most probable explanation of this fact is that a great inland power exercised control over Asia Minor down to the coast and excluded foreign settlements. This power was the empire of the Hittites. The ruins of their capital have been found at Boghaz Köi in northwestern Cappadocia. Their kingdom seems to have been lasted from about 2000 to 800 B.C., and about the time of the fall of Knossos they extended their power southward by conquering North Syria, where they established a second capital at Carchemish. They had close political relations with Babylonia, as is shown by the clay tablets in two languages, Hittite and Babylonian, which have been excavated at Boghaz Köi. Their lordship extended in some form to the Troad and the western coast of Asia Minor. The conjecture may be hazarded that they were the people who destroyed the great brick fortress of Troy. Many of the influences which passed to and fro between the Aegean world and Mesopotamia may have been transmitted through the Hittites. Their southward expansion meant wars with the Egyptians, who also aspired to dominate Syria. In a battle which was fought at Kadesh in 1287 B.C. between the two rival powers, we find the Lycians and the Dardanians of the Troad fighting for their Hittite lords. But about this very time the Hittite power was declining, and northwestern Asia Minor, as far as the valley of the Sangarius, was wrested from their rule by swarms of new invaders from Europe. These were the Phrygians, to whose race the Dardanians belonged, and who were so closely akin to the Thracians that we may speak of the Phrygo-Thracian division of the Indo-European family. After the destruction of early Troy, centuries had passed during which no attempt was made to restore its vanished splendor. 3 different settlements indeed succeeded one another on its site, but they were insignificant, villages rather than castles. We may account for this long interval by the jealous policy of the Hittite kings. At length, before the middle of the 13th century, one of the Phrygian leaders built a strong stone fortress on the hill of Troy. This too disappeared. Probably, as we shall see, it succumbed to an enemy, and then not long afterwards, built by the same people, arose the great stronghold of Priam, the Troy of legend and history. The new Troy, through whose glory the name of the spot was to become a household word forever throughout all European lands, was built on the levelled ruins of the older towns. The circuit of the new city was far wider, and within a great wall of well-wrought stone the citadel rose terrace upon terrace to a highest point. On that commanding summit, as at Mycenae, we must presume that the king's palace stood. The houses, of which the foundations have been disclosed within the walls, have the same simple plan that we saw in the older brick city and in the palaces of Mycenae and Tiryns. The wall was pierced by 3 or 4 gates, the chief gate being on the southeast side, guarded by a flanking tower. The builders were more skilful than the masons of the ruder walls of the fortresses of Argolis, which belonged to an earlier age. To the Trojan realm were reckoned not only the men of the Trojan plain, but the Dardanians in the upper valley of the Scamander, among the hills of Ida, the country of the Homeric Aeneas, and to the east the inhabitants of the plains of the Granicus and the Aesopus. And south of Mount Ida were a number of strongholds inhabited by Pelasgian tribes, who represented the original inhabitants of the country whom the Trojans had subdued. The lords of Troy, whether of the earlier fortress of brick or the later of stone, did not owe their power and wealth to the fertility of the soil or to any natural products of the region in which they had fixed their abode. The little plain, watered by the Scamander, has no advantages in itself to attract settlers, and its coasts, north and west, offer no good harbourage for ships. The fortune of Troy was due to the difficulties of navigation which beset mariners trading between the Aegean and the Euxine. The prevailing summer winds from north, northeast, and northwest used to detain sailing ships for days or weeks at the mouth of the Hellespont. The sailors wanted anchorage, and they wanted fresh water, which was to be got from the Scamander, and also on the west coast at Bashika Bay. These things the masters of the Scamander plain had it in their power to grant or withhold. Hence Troy was in a position to control the trade which passed through the Hellespont. And here a number of converging lines of traffic met. From Thrace and Paeonia came wine, swords, white horses, and perhaps gold. From Paphlagonia and the southern coast of the Euxine came timber, silver, vermilion, wild asses. Southward there was the commerce of the Meonians and Carians and Lycians. The Meonians, who were noted as slave dealers, dwelled in the land which was afterwards to be Lydia, on the banks of the Hermus and in the plain of Sardis. The Carians possessed Miletus, where there were skilful workers in ivory, and the districts of the Meander. The Lycians probably held much of the carrying trade from Egypt and Syria to northern Europe. The policy of Troy, which was, we may say, its very reason for existing, was to levy a toll upon all the traffic which converged on the Hellespontine shores. If there was, as has been supposed, a great yearly market in the Trojan plain, to which traders from all quarters came by sea or land with their merchandise, it was an arrangement which was not only profitable to the Trojan king who received the market dues, but may have been convenient to many of the merchants, sparing them longer journeys. Sacred Troy was thus a parasite which grew fat on the produce of others, and the Greeks, who desired to have access to the Euxine and to trade freely with all the world, determined to destroy it. We may conjecture that the fall of the fifth city in the course of the 13th century was the result of Achaean enterprise, and was the fact which suggested the legend of the sack of Troy by Heracles. This story is closely connected with the tale of the Argonauts, for Heracles embarked at Ioleus with the other heroes in the Argo, and left the ship during the voyage and destroyed Troy. It looks as if behind the whole legend there lurked the tradition of Greek attempts to navigate the Euxine between the fall of the fifth and the rise of the sixth city. So many legends of the heroic age of Greece have been proved by recent discoveries to have a historical basis, that there was nothing rash in supposing that here, too, imagination was not building in the void, but was working on the memory of definite events. It was probably at the beginning of the 12th century, as Greek tradition reckoned, that the Achaeans made ready a great expedition to exterminate the parasitic power which preyed upon the trade of the world. It is uncertain how far the Greek states of the time can be described as a federation or an empire, with a definite organization under the supremacy of Argos. But there seems no reason to doubt that the Achaean king of Argos, whose name in Greek tradition was Agamemnon, succeeded in enlisting the cooperation of the chief kings and princes of northern as well as southern Greece. It looks, indeed, as if the Achaean lords of Phthia and Thessaly, the country from which the Argo sailed, had a particular interest in the enterprise. All sailed to the plain of Troy. It was vain to hope that they could take by storm the well-walled castle of Priam. Their hope was to cut off all the trade on which Troy depended for her livelihood and to starve her out. The tradition that the siege was long, 9 years according to the poets, is therefore in accordance with the conditions of the war. The Greeks supported themselves by raids on the surrounding subjects and allies of the Trojans. Priam's city fell. Her fall was the necessary prelude to the opening of the Propontis and the Euxine Sea to Greek commerce and colonization. When the Greeks, in later days, established themselves securely on the Hellespont and the Bosphorus, the hill of Troy ceased to have any value as a site, and though it was again inhabited, it was little more than a place of famous memories. Part V. The Homeric Poems. The later period of the heroic age, its manners of life, its material environment, its social organization, its political geography, are reflected in the Homeric poems. Although the poets who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey probably did not live before the 9th century, they derived their matter from older lays which must have belonged to the generations immediately succeeding the Trojan War. After the age of bronze had passed away, and the conditions of life and the political shape of the Greek world had been utterly changed, it would have been impossible for anyone, however imaginative, unless he were a scientific aquarian with an abundance of records at his command, to create a consistent picture of a vanished civilization. And the picture which Homer presents is a consistent picture, closely corresponding in its main features and in remarkable details to the evidence which has been recently recovered from the earth and described in the foregoing pages. The Homeric palace is built on the same general plan as the palaces that have been found at Mycenae and Tiryns, at Troy and in Boeotia. The equipment of the Homeric heroes and the man-screening Homeric shield receive their best illustration from Mycenaean gems and jars. The blue inlaid frieze in the vestibule of the hall of Tiryns proves that the poet's frieze of Cyanus in the hall of Alcinous was not a fancy, and he describes as the cup of Nestor a gold cup with doves perched on the handles, such as one which was found in a royal tomb at Mycenae. The subjects wrought on the shield which the mastersmith made for Achilles may be illustrated by works of art found at Mycenae and in Crete. The shield, wrought in bronze, tin, silver, and gold, is round and has a ringed space in the center, encompassed by 3 concentric girdles. In the middle is the earth, the sea, and the heaven, with the unwearied sun and the moon at her full, and all the stars wherewith heaven is crowned. The subject of the first circle is peace and war. Here are scenes in a city at peace: banquets, brides borne through the streets by torchlight to their new homes, the elders dealing out justice. There is another city besieged, and scenes of battle. The second circle shows scenes from country life at various seasons of the year: ploughing in spring, the ploughman drinking a draught of wine as he reaches the end of the black furrow, a king watching reapers reaping in his meadows, and the preparations for a harvest festival. A bright vintage scene: young men and maids bearing the sweet fruit in wicker baskets, and dancing while a boy plays a lyre and sings the song of Linus. Herdsmen with their dogs pursuing two lions which had carried off an ox from the banks of a sounding river. A pasture and shepherds' huts in the mountain glen. The whole was girded by the third, outmost circle, through which the great might of the river Oceanus flowed, rounding off as it were the life of mortals by its girdling stream. The whole conception is due to the imagination of the poet, but similar scenes of peace and war were depicted by the artists of the Aegean, as for instance on the Cretan plaques, which probably adorn the cover of a chest of cypress wood, on which we saw a city represented, and on a vase of steatite, decorated by a picture of what is probably a harvest festival. The siege is illustrated by the scene of the leaguered city on the silver beaker, and dagger blades discovered at Mycenae show brilliant examples of the art of inlaying on metal. The art of writing, too, is mentioned in the Iliad, in the story of Bellerophon, who carries from Argos to Lycia deadly symbols in a folded tablet. The fact, which was doubted till a few years ago, that writing was practised in the heroic age, shows that the poet was guilty of no anachronism. There is indeed one striking difference in custom. The Mycenaean tombs reveal few traces of the habit of burning the dead, which the Homeric Greeks invariably practised, while beyond what is implied in a single mention of embalming, the poems completely ignore the practice of burial. In later times both customs existed in Greece side by side. The explanation of this discrepancy seems to be that cremation was a practice introduced by the Achaeans. Hexameter verse must have already been far on its way to perfection in the 12th century when the Greek bards used it to commemorate the Trojan War. The glorification of Achilles and other features of the Iliad point to northern Greece, where was the kingdom of Achilles and Phthia, as the home of one of these early minstrels. Southern Greece doubtless had its singers too, and here, we may suspect, the story of the homecoming of Odysseus took its first shape, marked as it is by a lively interest in the Peloponnesus and Crete. Part 6. Political and social organization of the early Greeks. The Homeric poems give us our earliest glimpse of the working of those political institutions which were the common heritage of most of the children, whether children by adoption or by birth, of the Aryan stock, of Greek, Roman, and German alike. They show us the king at the head, but he does not govern wholly of his own will. He is guided by a council of the chief men of the community whom he consults, and the decisions of the council and king, deliberating together, are brought before the assembly of the whole people. Out of these three elements, king, council, and assembly, the constitutions of Europe have grown. Here are the germs of all the various forms of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But in the most ancient times this political organization was weak and loose. The true power in primitive society was the family. When we first meet the Greeks, they lived together in family communities. Their villages are habitations of a genos, that is, of a clan, or family in a wide sense, all the members being descended from a common ancestor and bound together by the tie of blood. Originally the chief of the family had the power of life and death over all who belonged to the family, and it was only as the authority of the state grew and asserted itself against the comparative independence of the family that this power gradually passed away. But the village communities are not, as they were in the Asian foreworld, isolated and independent. They are part of a larger community which is called the phyle or tribe. The tribe is the whole people of the kingdom, in the kingdom's simplest form, and the territory which the tribe inhabited was called its deme. When a king became powerful and won sway over the demes of neighbouring kings, a community consisting of more than one tribe would arise, and while each tribe had to merge its separate political institutions in the common institutions of the whole state, it would retain its separate identity within the larger union. It was usual for several families to group themselves together into a society called a phratria or brotherhood, which had certain common religious usages. The organization of clan and tribe, with the intermediate union of the phratry, was a framework derived from the Aryan forefathers, shared at least by other Aryan races. For we find the same institutions among the Romans and among the Germans. The clan is the foundation of Roman society, and the Julian gens, for instance, has exactly the same social significance as the genus of the Achaemenids of Attica. The phyle is the Roman tribe, and the phratry corresponds to the Roman curia, and to our own English hundred. The importance of the brotherhood is illustrated by Homer's description of an outcast, as one who has no brothers and no hearth. The importance of the family is most vividly shown in the manner in which the Greeks possessed the lands which they conquered. The soil did not become the private property of individual freemen, nor yet the public property of the whole community. The king of the tribe or tribes marked out the whole territory into parcels, according to the number of families in the community, and the families cast lot for the estates. Each family then possessed its own estate. The head of the family administered it, but had no power of alienating it. The land belonged to the whole kin, but not to any particular member. The right of property in land seems to have been based, not on the right of conquest, but on a religious sentiment. Each family buried their dead within their own domain, and it was held that the dead possessed for ever and ever the soil where they lay, and that the land round a sepulchre belonged rightfully to their living kinsfolk, one of whose highest duties was to protect and tend the tombs of their fathers. The king was at once the chief priest, the chief judge, and the supreme warlord of the tribe. He exercised a general control over religious ceremonies, except in cases where there were special priesthoods. He pronounced judgment, and dealt out justice to those who came to his judgment seat to have their wrongs righted. And he led forth the host to war. He belonged to a family which claimed descent from the gods themselves. His relation to his people was conceived as that of a protecting deity. He was revered as a god in the deme. The kingship passed from sire to son, but it is probable that personal fitness was recognized as a condition of the kingly office, and the people might refuse to accept a degenerate son who was unequal to the tasks that his father had fulfilled. The sceptred king had various privileges, the seat of honor at feasts, a large and choice share of booty taken in war, and of food offered at sacrifices. A special close of land was marked out and set apart for him as a royal domain, distinct from that which his family owned. The royal functions were vague enough, and a king had no power to enforce his will if it did not meet the approval of the heads of the people. He must always look for the consent and seek the opinion of the deliberative council of the elders. Strictly, perhaps, the members of the council ought to have been the heads of all the clans, and they would thus have represented the whole tribe, or all the tribes if there are more than one. But we must take it for granted, as an ultimate fact, which we have not the means of explaining, that certain families had come to hold a privileged position above the others, had, in fact, been marked out as noble, and claimed descent from Zeus, and the council was composed of this nobility. In the puissant authority of this council of elders lay the germ of future aristocracy. More important than either king or council for the future growth of Greece was the gathering of the people, out of which democracy was to spring. All the freemen of the tribe, all the freemen of the nation when more tribes had been united, met together not at stated times, but whenever the king summoned them, to hear and acclaim what he and his councillors proposed. to hear and acclaim, but not to debate or propose themselves. As yet the gathering of the folk for purposes of policy had not been differentiated from the gathering for the purpose of war. The host which the king led forth against the foe was the same as the folk which assented, by silence or applause, to the declarations of his will in the agora. The assembly was not yet distinguished as an institution from the army, and if Agamemnon summons his host to declare his resolutions in the plain of Troy, such a gathering is the agora in no figurative sense. It is no mere military assembly formed on the model of a political assembly. It is, in the fullest sense, the assembly of the people, the fellow institution of the Roman comitia, our own Gemote, derived all three from the same old Aryan gatherings. The king was surrounded by a body of companions, or retainers, who were attached to him by personal ties of service, and seem often to have abode in his palace. The companions are the same institution as the thanes of our English kings. And if kingship had held its ground in Greece, the companions might possibly, as in England, have developed into a new order of nobility, founded not on birth, but on the king's own choice for his service. Though the monarchy of this primitive form, as we find it reflected in the Homeric lays, generally passed away, it survived in a few outlying regions which lagged behind the rest of the Hellenic world in political development. Thus the Macedonian Greeks in the lower valley of the Axius retained a constitution of the old Homeric type till the latest times, the royal power continually growing. At the close of the tale of Greek conquest and expansion, which began on the Caister and ended on the Hyphasis, we shall come back by a strange revolution to the Homeric state. When all the diverse forms of the rule of the few and the rule of the many, which grew out of the primitive monarchy, have had their day, we shall see the Macedonian warrior, who is to complete the work that was begun by the Achaean conquerors of Troy, attended by his companions like Agamemnon or Achilles, and ruling his people like an Achaean king of men. The constitutional fabric of the Greek states was thus simple and loose in the days of Homer. Perhaps few large communities had come into Greece, but larger communities were constantly formed in the course of the conquest. In the later part of the royal period, a new movement is setting in which is to decide the future of Greek history. The city begins to emerge and take form and shape out of the loose aggregate of villages. The inhabitants of a plain or valley are induced to leave their scattered villages and make their dwellings side by side in one place, which would generally be under the shadow of the king's fortress. At first the motive would be to gain the protection afforded by joint habitation in unsettled times, just as we find in an earlier age villages grouped under the citadel of Mycenae. Sometimes the group of villages would be girt by a wall, sometimes the protection of the castle above would be deemed enough. The change from village to city life was general but not universal. Many communities continued to live in villages, and did not form cities till long afterwards. The movement was promoted by the kings, and it is probable that strong kings often brought it about by compulsion. But in promoting it, they were unwittingly undermining the monarchical constitution, and paving the way for their own abolition. A city-state naturally tends to be a republic. In the heroic age, then, the state had not fully emerged from the society. No laws were enacted and maintained by the state. Those ordinances and usages which guided the individual man in his conduct, and which are necessary for the preservation of any society, were maintained by the sanction of religion. There were certain crimes which the gods punished, but it was for the family, not for the whole community, to deal with the shedder of blood. The justice which the king administered was really arbitration. A stranger had no right of protection, and might be slain in a foreign community, unless he was bound by the bond of guest friendship with a member of that community, and then he came under the protection of Zeus the hospitable. Wealth in these ages consisted of herds and flocks, for though the Greeks were tillers of the soil, and had settled in a country which was already agricultural, the land was not rich enough to bestow wealth. The value of a suit of armor, for instance, or a slave, was expressed in oxen. Piracy was a common trade, as was inevitable in a period when there was no organized maritime power strong enough to put it down. So many practised this means of livelihood that it bore no reproach, and when seamen landed on a strange strand, the natural question to ask them was, "Outlanders, whence come ye? Are ye robbers that rove the seas?" End of Chapter 1, Parts 4 through 6.
Chapter 1, Part 7 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 1, Part 7. The Dorian Conquest. The heroic age of Greece may be said to have come to an end within 2 generations after the Trojan War. A dark period of about 2 centuries followed, which were marked by the disappearance of the old civilization, by the expansion of the Greek race over the Aegean, and by wide political changes in the mother country. The transition to the new period corresponds to the transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age. The old Aegean fashions of pottery are replaced by a style distinguished by geometrical decorations, and hence in the history of art the geometric age is often used as a convenient designation. The pressure of Illyrian peoples across the northern frontiers of Greece seems to have been the principal cause of the changes. The Dorians, who appear upon the scene and play the leading part in transforming Greece, were probably of Illyrian stock. Unlike the earlier northern invaders, the Achaeans, they destroyed instead of adopting the civilization which they found. The Dorians did not come with horses, they fought on foot, and their weapons were iron. The southward pressure of the Illyrians was fatal to Aetolia. In the Homeric poems we have a reflected glimpse of the prosperity of the Aetolian coastland. We see that Pleuron by the sea and rocky Calydon and the other strong cities of that region were abreast of the civilization of the heroic age, and the Aetolian myth of Meleager and the hunting of the Caledonian bear became a part of the heritage of the national legend of Greece. Maritime Aetolia was then a land of wine; its pride in its vineyards is displayed in the names of its mythic kings. But in the later ages of Greek history all this is changed. We find Aetolia regarded as a half-barbarous country, the abode of men who speak indeed a Greek tongue, but have lagged ages and ages behind the rest of Greece in science and civilization. And we find the neighbouring countries in the same case. Epirus, or the greater part of it, had been Hellenized when the worship of Zeus was introduced at Dodona, to become famous and venerable throughout the Greek world. Suddenly it lapses into comparative barbarism, and the sanctuary of Dodona remains a lonely outpost. The explanation of this falling away is the irruption and conquest of Illyrian invaders. It was not through laziness or degeneracy, or through geographical disadvantages, that the Greeks of Epirus and Aetolia fell out of the race. It was because they were overwhelmed by a rude and barbarous people, who swamped their civilization instead of assimilating it. The Aetolians and Epirots of later history are mainly of Illyrian stock. This invasion naturally drove some of the Greek inhabitants to seek new homes elsewhere. It was easy to cross the Gulf, and Aetolian immigrants made their way to the river Peneus, where they settled and took to themselves the name of Ilians or Dalesmen. They won dominion over the Epeans, the first Greek settlers, and gradually extended their power to the Alpheus. Their land was a tract of downs with a harbourless coast, and they never became a maritime power. The people in this western plain of the peninsula were distinguished by the veneration of the hero Pelops. His worship had taken deep root at Pisa on the banks of the river Alpheus. It was a spot which in a later age, when the Greeks had spread overseas into distant lands, was to become one of the holiest seats of Greek religion, where the greatest of the Aryan, the supremest of the Hellenic, gods was to draw to his sacred precinct men from all quarters of the Greek world to do him honour with the sacrifices and games. But even when Pisa had come to be illustrious as Olympia, even when the temple and altar of the Olympian Zeus had eclipsed all other associations of the place, Pelops still received his offering. But, though Pelops himself was remembered only as a legendary figure, except in one or two places like Olympia where his old worship survived, his name is living still in one of the most familiar geographical names of Greece. It is in the regions near the mouth of the Corinthian Gulf, where the existence of the bridge at Corinth may be easily unremembered, that men would be most tempted to call the great peninsula an island. And so, when Pelops was still widely worshipped, the name Island of Pelops may have originated on that side, not probably in the peninsula itself, but on the opposite shores, in Aetolia, for example, and then it made its way into universal use, and clung henceforward to southern Greece. The pressure of the Illyrians in Epirus may be associated with two movements of great consequence, the Thessalonian and the Boeotian migration. A backward Greek folk named the Petholoi, but called by men of the other districts Thessaloi, crossed the hills and settled in the western corner of the land which is bounded by Pelion and Pindus. They gained the upper hand and spread their sway over the whole plain. They drove the Achaeans southwards into the mountains of Phthia, and henceforward these Achaeans play no part of any note in the history of Greece. The Thessalian name soon spread over the whole country, which is called Thessaly to the present day. Crannon, Pagasae, Larissa, and Pherae became the seats of lords who reared horses and governed the surrounding districts. The conquered people were reduced to serfdom and were known as the laborers. They cultivated the soil, at their own risk, paying a fixed amount to their lords, and they had certain privileges. They could not be sold abroad or arbitrarily put to death. But they gained one victory over their conquerors: the Achaean language prevailed. The Thessalians gave up their own idiom and learned, not indeed without modifying, the speech of their subjects, so that the dialect of historic Thessaly bears a close resemblance to the tongue which we find spoken by the Achaean settlers in Asia Minor. When they had established themselves in the lands of the Peneus, the Thessalians pressed northward against the Pherae, eastward against the Magnates, and southward against the Achaeans of Phthia, and reduced them all to tributary subjection. We know almost nothing of the history of the Thessalian kingdoms. In later times we find the whole country divided into four great divisions: Thessaloitis in the southwest, the quarter which may have been the first settlement and home of the Thessalian invaders; Phthiotis of the Achaeans in the south; Pelasgoitis, a name which records the survival of the Pelasgians, one of the older peoples; and Histiaoitis, the land of the Histiaeans, who have no separate identity in history. All the lordships of the land were combined in a very loose political organization, which lay dormant in times of peace, but through which, to meet any emergency of war, they could elect a common captain, with the title of Tegos. But all the folk did not remain to fall under the thraldom imposed by the new lords. A portion of the Achaeans migrated southward to the Peloponnesus and founded settlements along the strip of coast which forms the southern side of the Corinthian Gulf, and was henceforth called Achaia. Thus there were two Achaean lands: the old Achaia in the north, now shrunk to the mountains of Phthia, and the new Achaia in the south. There was also apparently a movement to Euboea, in consequence of the Thessalian invasion. According to tradition, Histiaea in the north of the island and Eretria in the centre owed their origin to settlers from Thessaly, and there is independent evidence that there was truth in this tradition. The lands of Helicon and Kithaeron experienced a similar shock to that which unsettled and changed the lands of Olympus and Othrys, but the results were not the same. The old home of the Boeotians was in Mount Boan in Epirus. The mountain gave them their name. Their dialect was probably closely akin to the original dialect of the Thessalians, being marked by certain characters which enable us to distinguish roughly a northwestern group of dialects from those spoken by the earliest invaders of Greece. Coming from the west or north, the Boeotians first occupied places in the west of the land which they were to make their own. From Chaeronea and Coronia they won Thebes, the city of the Cadmeans. Thence they sought to spread their power over the whole land. They spread their name over it, for it was called Boeotia, but they did not succeed in winning full domination as rapidly as the Thessalians succeeded in Thessaly. The rich lords of Orchomenus preserved their independence for hundreds of years, and it was not till the 6th century that anything like a Boeotian unity was established. The policy of the Boeotian conquerors, who were perhaps comparatively few in number, was unlike that of the Thessalians. The conquered communities were not reduced to serfdom. On the other hand, they did not, like the Thessalians, adopt or adapt the speech of the older inhabitants, but the idioms of the conquerors and conquered coalesced and formed a new Boeotian dialect. The Boeotian conquest, there can be little doubt, caused some of the older peoples to wander forth to other lands, and it may explain the participation of the Cadmeans and the men of Labadia and others in some of the Ionian settlements in Asia Minor. Moreover, the coming of the Boeotians probably unsettled some of the neighbouring peoples and drove them to change their abodes. West of Boeotia, in the land of the Phocians, amid the regions of Mount Parnassus, there were dislocations of a less simple kind. Hither came the Dorians. For a while, it would seem, a large space of mountainous country between Mount Oeta and the Corinthian Gulf, including a great part of Phocis, became Dorian land. The greater part of them soon went forth to seek fairer abodes in distant places. But a few remained behind in the small basin-like district between Mount Oeta and Mount Parnassus, where they preserved the illustrious Dorian name throughout the course of Grecian history, in which they never played a part. It would seem that the Dorians also took possession of Delphi, the rocky threshold of Apollo, and planted some families there who devoted themselves to the service of the god. After the departure of the Dorian wanderers, the Phocians could breathe again, but Doris was lost to them, and Delphi, which, as we shall see, they often essayed to recover. And the Phocians had to reckon with other neighbours. In later times we found the Locrians split up into 3 divisions, and the Phocians wedged in between. One division, the Ozolian Locrians, are on the Corinthian Gulf, to the west of Phocis. The other 2 divisions are on the Euboean Sea, to the northeast of Phocis. The Oslians were one of the most backward peoples of Greece. The Locrians of the north play a part in the Iliad, under the leadership of their hero Ajax, who ruled over Thronion as well as over Opus, and Locris was probably a continuous strip along the coast of the Euboean Straits. The Phocians wanted an outlet to the sea and severed it into 2 parts. The departure of the Dorians from the regions of Parnassus was probably gradual, and it was accomplished by sea. They built ships, perhaps the name of Naupactus, the place of the shipbuilding, is a record of their ventures, and they sailed around the Peloponnesus to the southeastern parts of Greece. One band of adventurers brought a new element to Crete, the island of many races, others settled in Thera and Melos. Others sailed away eastward, beyond the limits of the Aegean, and found a home on the southern coast of Asia Minor, where, surrounded by barbarians and forgotten by the Greek world, they lived a life apart, taking no share in the history of Hellas. But they preserved their Hellenic speech, and their name, the Pamphylians, recorded their Dorian origin, being the name of one of the 3 tribes by which the Dorians were everywhere recognized. The next conquests of the Dorians were in the Peloponnesus. They had found it impossible to attack on the north and west; they now essayed it on the south and east. There were 3 distinct conquests: conquest of Laconia, on the conquest of Argolis, the conquest of Corinth. The Dorians took possession of the rich vale of the Eurotas, and keeping their own Dorian stock pure from the mixture of alien blood, reduced all the inhabitants to the condition of subjects. It seems probable that the Dorian invaders who subdued Laconia were more numerous than the Dorian invaders elsewhere. The eminent quality which distinguished the Dorians from other branches of the Greek race was that which we call character, and it was in Laconia that this quality most fully displayed and developed itself, for here the Dorian seems to have remained more purely Dorian. In Argolis the course of things ran otherwise. The invaders, who landed under a king called Temenos, had doubtless a hard fight, but their conquest took the shape not of subjugation but of amalgamation. The Argive state was indeed organized on the Dorian system, with the 3 Dorian tribes, the Hillais, the Pamphyli, and the Damanists, but otherwise few traces of the conquest remained. It is to the time of this conquest that the overthrow of Mycenae is probably to be referred. Certain it is that both Mycenae and Tyrians were destroyed suddenly and set on fire. Henceforward Argos, under her lofty citadel, was to be undisputed queen of the Argive plain. Greater, indeed, was the feat which the Dorians wrought in their southern conquest, the feat of making lowly Sparta, without citadel or wall, the queen of the Laconian vale. Dorian ships were also rowed up the Saronic Gulf. It was the adventure of a prince whom the legend calls Arant, the son of Ryder, and seized the high hill of Acrocorinth, the key of the peninsula. This was the making of Corinth. Here, as in Argolis, there was no subjection, no distinction between the conquerors and the conquered. The geographical position of Corinth between her seas determined for her people a career of commerce, and her history shows that the Dorians had the qualities of bold and skilful traders. From Argos the Dorians made two important settlements in the north, on the river Asopus, Sicyon on its lower, and Philius on its upper banks. And beyond Mount Geronea another Dorian city arose, we know not how, on the commanding hill which looks down upon the western shore of Salamis. Its name was Nisa. But the hill had been crowned by a royal palace in the heroic age, and so the place came to be known Megara, the palace, and in historical times no other name was known, though the old name lurked in the name of the harbour Nisaea. In later days Dorian Megara was associated politically with the Peloponnesus, rather than with northern Greece. In pre-Dorian days it had been reckoned as part of Boeotia, separated though it was from that country by the western portion of the massive range of Katharon. The island, whose conical mountain in the midst of the Saronic waters is visible to all the coasts around, also was destined to become a Dorian land. Aegina was conquered by Dorian settlers from Epidaurus, but the conquest was perhaps not effected for 200 years or more after the subjugation of Argolis. In Aegina, too, there was doubtless a fusion of the old inhabitants and the new settlers, and we may be sure that it had been before, as it was after, the change an island of bold and adventurous sailors. In Crete and Laconia we meet, as we shall see, some peculiar institutions, which seem to have been characteristically Dorian, but are not found in Argos or Corinth. Yet all the Dorian settlements remembered their common Dorian origin, and the conquerors of Laconia, at least, looked with emotions of filial piety towards the little obscure Doris in the highlands of Parnassus as their mother country. The evidence of the three Dorian tribes might help to maintain the consciousness of a Dorian section of Greece, but it was perhaps the rise of a new Doris, on the other side of the Aegean, that elevated the Dorian name into permanent national significance. End of Chapter 1, Part 7. Recording by Sibella Denton.
Chapter 1, Part 8 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalinda. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnall Bury, Chapter 1, Part 8. The expansion of the Greeks over the Aegean islands, and the plantation of Greek settlements along the western coast of Asia Minor, began when the heroic age was drawing to a close, and continued for about a century and a half. This movement was promoted, and in some of its stages directly caused by the consequences of the Dorian invasion and the migrations in northern Greece. But it may have begun without any external pressure, perhaps on account of overpopulation, and partly in a spirit of enterprise which was tempted by the fertile river valleys and plains of the Asiatic coast, where there was now no great power to oppose them. The Hittite empire had fallen back from the west, which it was never to reach again. It does not appear even on the distant horizon in the Homeric poems. Apart from the early settlements in the island of Rhodes, which were previous to the Trojan War, the first Greeks who sailed across the Aegean to find new homes were the Achaeans and their fellows from the hills and plains of Thessaly and the plain of the Spercheius. Their expeditions probably started from the landlocked bay of Pagasae, and tradition long afterwards associated the first sea ventures of the Greeks with the port of Iavolcos. Along with the Achaeans there sailed as comrades and allies the Aeolians. Some, indeed, believe that Aeolian was simply another name for Achaean. But it seems safer to regard the Aeolians as distinct from, though closely related to, the Achaeans. It is impossible to determine whether those who crossed the Aegean were settlers in Thessaly, and not rather some of the Aeolians who lived beyond the mountains by another seaboard on the northern shore of the Corinthian Gulf. We know that in early times these Aeolians were engaged in constant warfare with the Aetolians, who ultimately won the upper hand and gave their name to the whole country. And perhaps the pressure of these foes induced some of them to throw in their lot with the Achaeans, who were sailing in search of new homes beyond the sea. It was to the northern part of Asia Minor, the island of Lesbos and the opposite shores, that the Achaean and Aeolian adventurers steered their ships. Here they planted the first Hellenic settlements on Asiatic soil, the beginning of a movement which, before 1,000 years had passed away, was to carry Greek conquerors to the Indian Ocean. The coastlands of western Asia Minor are, like Greece itself, suitable for the habitations of a seafaring people. A series of river valleys are divided by mountain chains which run out into promontories so as to form deep bays, and the promontories are continued in islands. The valleys of the Hermus and the Caicus are bounded on the north by a chain of hills which run out into Lesbos. The valley of the Hermus is parted from that of the Cayster by mountains which are prolonged in Chios, and the valley of the Cayster is separated from the valley of the Maeander by a chain which terminates in Samos. South of the Maeander valley there are bays and islands, but the mountains of the mainland are broken by no rivers. The Greek occupation of the lower waters of the Hermus and Caicus is known to us only by its result. The invaders won the coastlands from the Mycenaean natives, and seized a number of strong places which they could defend: Pitana, Marina, Sima, Ege, Old Smyrna. They pressed up the rivers, and on the Hermus they founded Magnesia under Mount Sipylus. All this, needless to say, was not done at once. It must have been a work of many years, and of successive expeditions from the mother country. The Achaean wave of emigration was succeeded by another wave, flowing mainly from the coasts of Attica and Argolis, and new settlements were planted south of the elder Achaean settlements. The two-pronged peninsula between the Hermus and the Cayster rivers, with the off-lying isle of Chios, the valleys of the Cayster and Maeander, with Samos and the peninsula south of Mount Latmos, were studded with communities which came to form a group distinct from the older group in the north. Each group of settlements came to be called by a collective name. As the Achaeans were the most illustrious of the settlers in the north, one might expect to find the northern group known as Achaean. But it is not thus that names are given in primitive times. A number of cities or settlements, which have no political union, and are merely associated together by belonging to the same race and speaking the same tongue, do not generally choose themselves a common name. It rather happens that when they get a common name it is given to them by strangers who, looking from the outside, regard them as a group, and do not think of the differences of which they are themselves more vividly conscious. And it constantly happens that the name of one member of the group is, by some accident, picked out and applied to the whole. Thus it befell that the Aeolian and not the Achaean name was selected to designate the northern division of the Greek settlements in Asia, just as our own country came to be called not Saxony, but England. The southern and larger group of colonies received the name of Iavones, or Iones, as they called themselves, when they lost the letter V. The Iavones were a people who had settled on the coasts of Argolis and Attica, but there the name fell out of use, and perhaps passed out of memory, until on Asiatic soil it attained celebrity and re-echoed with glory to their old homes. But it would probably be a mistake to regard these two groups as well defined from the first. To begin with, it is possible that they overlapped chronologically. The latest of the Aeolian settlements may have been founded subsequently to the earliest of the Ionian. In the second place, the original homes of the settlers overlapped. Though the Aeolian colonies mainly came from the lands north of Mount Ida, apart from those who came from Aetolia, they included some settlers from the coasts of Boeotia and Euboea. Thus Sima, in Aeolus, derived its name from Euboean seamen; and, on the other hand, though the Ionian colonies were chiefly derived from the coasts of Attica and Argolis, apart from some contingents from Crete and other places in the south, there were also some settlers from the north. Thirdly, the two groups ran into each other geographically. Phocaea, for example, which is geographically in Aeolus, standing on the promontory north of the Hermus River, was included in Ionia. Its name shows that some of the men who colonized it were Phocians, and some of the places in North Ionia, Teos, for instance, had received Achaean settlements first, and were then resettled by Ionians. In Chios, which was afterwards fully in Ionia, a language of Aeolic complexion was once spoken. Of the foundation of the famous colonies of Ionia, of the order in which they were founded, and of the relations of the settlers with the Lydian natives, we know as little as of the settlements of the Achaeans. Clazomene and Teos arose on the north and south sides of the neck of the peninsula which runs out to meet Chios, and Chios, on the east coast of her island, faces Erythrae on the mainland, Erythrae the crimson, so called from its purple fisheries, the resort of Tyrian traders. Lepidus and Colophon lie on the coast as it retires eastward from Teos to reach the mouth of the Cayster, and there was founded Ephesus, the city of Artemis. By the streams of the Cayster was a plain called the Aegean Meadow, which destiny in some odd way selected to bestow a name upon one of the continents of the earth. South of Ephesus, and on the northern slope of Mount Mycale, was the religious gathering place of the Ionians, the temple of the Heliconian Poseidon, which, when once the Ionians became conscious of themselves as a sort of nation, and learned to glory in their common name, served to foster a sense of unity among all their cities from Phocaea in the north to Miletus in the south. Samos faces Mount Mycale, and the worship of Hera, which was the religious feature of Samos, is thought to point to men of Argos as participators in its original foundation. South of Mycale, the cities of Myus and Priena were planted on the Maeander. Then the coast retires to skirt Mount Latmos, and breaks forward again to form the promontory, at the northern point of which was Miletus with its once splendid harbour. There was one great inland city, Magnesia on the Maeander, which must not be confused with the inland Aeolian city, Magnesia on the Hermus. Though counted to Ionia, it was not of Ionian origin, for it was founded by the Magnetes of Thessaly, and settlers from Euboea and Boeotia took part in the colonization of Ionia, as well as the Ionians of Argolis and Attica. The old inhabitants, Leleges, Maeonians, Carians, probably offered no prolonged resistance to the invaders. The old inhabitants, Leleges, Maeonians, Carians, probably offered no prolonged resistance to the invaders, and in some places, as the Carians, for example, at Miletus, they mixed with the Greek strangers. The colonists carried with them into the new Greece beyond the seas traditions of the old civilization which, in the mother country, was being overwhelmed by the Dorian invaders. And those traditions helped to produce the luxurious Ionian civilization which meets us some centuries later, when we come into the clearer light of recorded history. And they carried with them their minstrelsy, their lays of Troy, celebrating the deeds of Achilles and Agamemnon and Odysseus. The epic poetry of Greece entered upon a new period in Ionia. It was perhaps in the 9th century that the Iliad as we know it came into being. A poet of supreme genius arose, and it may be that he was the singer whose name was actually Homer. This famous name has the humble meaning of hostage, and we may fancy, if we care, that the poet was carried off in his youth as a hostage in some local strife. He composed his poetry in rugged Chios, and he gives us a local touch when he describes the sun as rising over the sea. From him the Homerid family of the bards of Chios were sprung. He took as his main argument the older poem of the Wrath of Achilles, and expanded it into the shape and compass of the greater part of the Iliad, including one of the noblest episodes in the whole epic, Priam's ransoming of Hector. Tradition made Homer the author of both the great epics, the Odyssey as well as the Iliad. This is not probable. But no great length of time need separate the composition of the two poems. Homer did not give to the Iliad the exact shape in which it was ultimately transmitted, for it received from his successors in the art some additions and extensions which were not entirely to its advantage. He was no mere stringer together of ancient lays. He took the motives, he caught the spirit of the older poems. He wove them into the fabric of his own composition. But he was himself as divinely inspired as any of the elder minstrels, and he was the father of epic poetry in the sense in which we distinguish an epic poem with a large argument from a short heroic lay. His work was thoroughly artificial, conscious art, as the greatest poetry always is, and it is probable that he committed the Iliad to writing. As he and his successors sang in Ionia, at the courts of Ionian princes, he dealt freely with the dialect of the old Achaean poems. The Iliad was arrayed in Ionic dress, and ultimately became so identified with Ionia that the Achaean origin of the older poetry was forgotten. The transformation was not, indeed, perfect, for sometimes the Ionian forms did not suit the metre, and the Aeolian forms were used. But the change was accomplished with wonderful skill. It is probable that the Ionian poet also did much to adapt the epic material which he used to the taste and moral ideas of a more refined age. The Iliad is notably free from the features of crude savagery which generally mark the early literature of primitive peoples. Only a few slight traces remain to show that there was in the background ugly and barbarous things over which a veil has been drawn. In other respects, the Ionian poets have faithfully preserved the atmosphere of the past ages of which they sung. They preserved its manners, its environment, its geography. Only an occasional anachronism slips in, which in the otherwise consistent picture can easily be detected. Unwittingly, for instance, the poet of the Odyssey allows it to escape that he lived in the Iron Age, for such a proverb as "The mere gleam of iron lures a man to strife" could not have arisen until iron weapons had long been in use. But he is at pains to preserve the weapons and gear of the Bronze Age. Homer preserved the memory of the Trojan War as a great national enterprise. The Iliad was regarded as something of far greater significance than an Ionian poem. It was accepted as a national epic, and was, from the first, a powerful influence in promoting among the Greeks community of feeling and tendencies toward national unity. For 200 years after its birth the Iliad went on gathering editions, and the bards were not unready to make insertions in order to satisfy the pride of the princely and noble families at whose courts they sang. The Odyssey, affiliated as it was to the Trojan legend, became a national epic too, and the interest awakened in Greece by the idea of the Trojan War was displayed by the composition of a series of epic poems, dealing with those events of the siege which happened both before and after the events described in the Iliad, and with the subsequent history of some of the Greek heroes. These poems were anonymous, and passed under the name of Homer. Along with the Iliad and Odyssey, they formed a chronological series which came to be known as the epic cycle. The Ionic settlements did not complete the Greek colonizations of Asia Minor. The Dorian conquest of the eastern Peloponnesus was followed by a Dorian expansion beyond the seas and a colonization of the Asiatic coast, to the south of Ionia. The Carians had spread over this region down to the border of Lycia, and had pressed the older inhabitants into the promontory which faces the island of Calymna. Here the Leleges participated in the latest stages of the Aegean Civilization, as we know by the pottery and other things which have been discovered at Termora in chamber tombs. These round tombs, not hewn out of the earth, like the vaulted sepulchres of Mycenae, but built above ground, are found in many parts of the peninsula, and remain as the most striking memorial of the Leleges. The bold promontories below Miletus, the islands of Kos and Rhodes, were occupied by colonists from Argolis, Laconia, Corinth, and Crete. On the mainland, Halicarnassus was the most important Dorian settlement, but it was formed in concert with the Carian natives, and was half Carian. This new Doris eclipsed in fame, and shed a new lustre on the old Doris under Mount Ada. All the settlements were independent, but they kept alive their communion of interest and sentiment by the common worship of the Triopian Apollo. The Carians were a vigorous people. They impressed themselves upon their land, and soon men began to forget that it had not always been Caria. They took to the sea, and formed a maritime power of some strength, so that in later ages a tradition was abroad that there was once upon a time a Carian sea supremacy, though no one could mention anything that it had achieved. The Carians also claimed to have made contributions to the art of war by introducing shield handles, and the crested helmet, and the emblazoning of shields, claims which we cannot test. The Greek fringe of Western Asia Minor was complete. It was impossible for Doris to creep round the corner and join hands with Pamphylia, for the Lycians presented an insuperable barrier. The Lycians were not a folk of Aryan speech, as a widely spread error supposes them to have been. Their language is related to the Carian. Their proper name was Tremili, but the name Lycian seems to have been given them by others as well as by the Greeks, who recognized in the chief Tremilian deity their own Apollo Lycios. But, though Lycia was not colonized, the Aegean was now entirely within the Greek sphere, excepting only its northern margin, where Greek enterprise in the future was to find a difficult field. It is important to observe that the process by which Asiatic Greece was created differs in character from the Dorian invasion of the Peloponnesus. The settlements of Ionia and Doris are examples of colonization. Bands of settlers went forth from their homes to find new habitations for themselves, but they left a home country behind them. The Dorian movements, on the other hand, partake of the character of folk wandering. The essential fact is that a whole people dispersed to seek new fields and pastures. For the paltry remnant which remained in the sequestered nook beyond Parnassus could not be called the parent people except by courtesy. The people, as a whole, had gone elsewhere. Before the completion of the Greek occupation of the western coast of Asia Minor, another migration left the shores of the Peloponnesus to seek a more distant home. Cyprus, an island whose geographical position marks it out to be contested between 3 continents, was now to receive European settlers. Throughout the Bronze Age it played an important part in supplying the Aegean countries with copper, and it exported timber, but it did not begin to share in the advanced civilization of the Aegean till the very last days of Cnossian supremacy. Then it received colonists from the Aegean, and developed an art which shows the characteristics of Cretan and Mycenaean art, with its own local peculiarities. At Salamis, in the east of the island, sepulchres have been found which show how Aegean culture flourished in Cyprus in the 14th century. The Cypriotes presently learned the craft of manufacturing iron, which was beginning to come into use. Their position, near Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, gave them favorable opportunities for commerce, which brought them wealth. The island was destined, however, to play a part in the world's debate as a wrestling ground between the European and the Asiatic, and the first Europeans who went forth for the struggle were the Peloponnesian Greeks, whom, we may suspect, the events of the Dorian invasion incited to wander. Much about the same time, the Phoenicians also began to plant settlements in the island, mainly in the centre. Amethys, Sidon, Idalion, Tamasus, Lapathus, and some places seem to have been colonized jointly by Phoenicians and Greeks, just as on the coast of Asia Minor Greeks and Carians mingled. A new Cypriot culture arose out of the intermingling of the two races and the old inhabitants. The worship of the great mother goddess, attended by doves, was native to Cyprus as to Crete, and the Greeks identified her with Aphrodite, who became universally known as the Cyprian goddess. The settlers in Cyprus spoke the Arcadian dialect, but this does not prove that their old homes were in Arcadia. Before the Dorians came and developed new dialects, the Arcadian speech, with but slight variations, seems to have prevailed in the coastlands as well as in the centre of the peninsula, and some of the Cypriot Greeks went forth from Laconia and Argolis. Some sailed from Salamis in the Attic Bay, and gave their name to Salamis in Cyprus. The colonists found already established a mode of linear writing which exhibits close resemblances to the Cretan system, and had probably been imported with the rest of Aegean civilization. This syllabic system was ill adapted to express the Greek language, but the colonists adapted it to their use. And although nothing is clumsier than a Greek writing in the Cypriot character, yet the Greeks of Cyprus clung to it when the rest of their race had learned the use of a finer instrument. If we look back now upon the early history of the Greeks, we see that though we can establish a probable chronology, there is only a single date which can lay claim to precision, and this concerns an event of minor importance, an Achaean raid on Egypt. For all the leading changes and movements we must be content with approximate limits. Greek-speaking peoples occupied Greece. 3rd millennium. Crete leading power in Aegean. Circa 2200 to 1400 BC. Advanced Aegean Civilization in Greece. From circa 1600 BC. Fall of Knossos. Circa 1400 BC. Achaeans invade North Greece. Before 1300 BC. Achaeans found principalities in Peloponnesus. 1300 to 1250 BC. Fall of 5th city of Troy. Circa 1250 BC. Achaeans of Thessaly join in raid on Egypt. 1229 BC. Trojan War. Early in 12th century. Thessalian conquest, Boeotian conquest, and beginnings of Achaean migration to Asia Minor towards end of 12th century. Ionian colonization in Asia Minor begins, Dorian conquests in Peloponnesus and Crete, Dorian colonization in Asia Minor begins, and Greek colonization of Cyprus, 11th century. Section 9. Fall of Greek monarchies and rise of the republics. Under their kings, the Greeks had conquered the coasts and islands of the Aegean, and had created the city-state. These were the two great contributions of monarchy to Grecian history. In forwarding the change from rural life in scattered thorps to life in cities, the kings were doubtless considering themselves as well as their people. They thought that the change would consolidate their own power by bringing the whole folk directly under their own eyes. But it also brought the king more directly under the eye of his folk. The frailties, incapacities, and misconduct of a weak lord were more noticed in the small compass of a city. He was more generally criticized and judged. City life, too, was less appropriate to the patriarchal character of the Homeric shepherd of the people. Moreover, in a city, those who were ill-pleased with the king's rule were more tempted to murmur together, and able more easily to conspire. Considerations like these may help us to imagine how it came about that throughout the greater part of Greece in the 8th century, the monarchies were declining and disappearing, and republics were taking their place. It is a transformation of which the actual process is hidden from us, and we can only guess at probable causes, but we may be sure that the deepest cause of all was the change to city life. The revolution was general, the infection caught and spread, but the change in different states must have had different occasions, just as it took different shapes. In some cases gross misrule may have led to the violent deposition of a king. In other cases, if the succession to the sceptre devolved upon an infant or a paltry man, the nobles may have taken it upon themselves to abolish the monarchy. In many places perhaps the change was slower. The kings who had already sought to strengthen their authority by the foundation of cities must have sought also to increase or define those vague powers which belonged to an Aryan ruler, sought, perhaps, to act of their own free will without due regard to the council's advice. When such attempts at magnifying the royal power went too far, the elders of the council might rise and gainsay the king, and force him to enter into a contract with his people that he would govern constitutionally. Of the existence of such contracts we have evidence. The old monarchy lasted into late times in remote Molosia, and there the king was obliged to take a solemn oath to rule his people according to law. In other cases the rights of the king might be strictly limited, in consequence of his seeking to usurp undue authority, and the imposition of limitations might go on until the office of king, although maintained in name, became in fact a mere magistracy, in a state wherein the real power had passed elsewhere. Of the survival of the monarchy in a limited form we have an example at Sparta. Of its survival as a mere magistracy we have an example at Athens. And it should be observed that the functions of the monarch were already restricted by limits which could easily be contracted further. Though he was the supreme giver of dooms, there might be other heads of clans or tribes in the state who could give dooms and judgment as well as he. Though he was the chief priest, there were other families than his to which certain priesthoods were confined. He was, therefore, not the sole fountain of justice or religion. There is a vivid scene in Homer which seems to have been painted when kings were seeking to draw tighter the reins of royal power. The poet, who is in sympathy with the kings, draws a comic and odious caricature of the bold carle with the gift of fluent speech, who criticizes the conduct and policy of the kings. Such an episode could hardly have suggested itself in the old days before city life had begun. Thersites is assuredly a product of the town. Odysseus, who rates and beats him, announces, in another part of the same scene, a maxim which has become as famous as Thersites himself: "The sovereignty of many is not good. Let there be one sovereign, one king." That is a maxim which would win applause for the minstrel in the banquet halls of monarchs who were trying to carry through a policy of centralization at the expense of the chiefs of the tribes. Where the monarchy was abolished, the government passed into the hands of those who had done away with it, the noble families of the state. The distinction of the nobles from the rest of the people is, as we have seen, an ultimate fact with which we have to start. When the nobles assume the government and become the rulers, an aristocratic republic arises. Sometimes the power is won, not by the whole body of the noble clans, but by the clan to which the king belonged. This was the case at Corinth, where the royal family of the Bacchiads became the rulers. In most cases the aristocracy and the whole nobility coincided, but in others, as at Corinth, the aristocracy was only a part of the nobility, and the constitution was an oligarchy of the narrowest form. At this stage of society the men of the noble class were the nerve and sinew of the state. Birth was then the best general test of excellence that could be found, and the rule of the nobles was a true aristocracy, the government of the most excellent. They practised the craft of ruling, they were trained in it, they handed it down from father to son, and though no great men arose great men are dangerous in an aristocracy the government was conducted with knowledge and skill. Close aristocracies, like the Corinthian, were apt to become oppressive, and when the day approached for aristocracies in their turn to give way to new constitutions, there were signs of grievous degeneration. But on the whole the Greek republics flourished in the aristocratic age, and were guided with eminent ability. The rise of the republics is about to take us into a new epoch of history, but it is important to note the continuity of the work which was to be done by the aristocracies with that which was accomplished by the kings. The two great achievements of the aristocratic age are the planting of Greek cities in lands far beyond the limits of the Aegean Sea, and the elaboration of political machinery. The first of these is simply the continuation of the expansion of the Greeks around the Aegean itself. But the new movement of expansion is distinguished, as we shall see, by certain peculiarities in its outward forms, features which were chiefly due to the fact that city life had been introduced before the colonization began. The beginning of colonization belonged to the age of transition, from monarchy to republic. It was systematically promoted by the aristocracies, and it took a systematic shape. The creation of political machinery carried on the work of consolidation, which the kings had begun when they gathered together into cities the loose elements of their states. When royalty was abolished, or put, as we say, into commission, the ruling families of the republic had to substitute magistracies tenable for limited periods, and had to determine how the magistrates were to be appointed, how their functions were to be circumscribed, how the provinces of authority were to be assigned. New machinery had to be created to replace that one of the three parts of the constitution which had disappeared. It may be added that under the aristocracies the idea of law began to take a clearer shape in men's minds, and the traditions which guided usage began to assume the form of laws. In the lays of Homer we hear only of the single dooms given by the kings or judges in particular cases. At the close of the aristocratic period comes the age of the lawgivers, and the aristocracies had prepared the material which the lawgivers improved, qualified, and embodied in codes. End of Chapter 1, Part 9. Recording by Kalinda, in Dover, New Hampshire, on July 10th, 2007.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are on the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater. Chapter 1, Part 10 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. The Greeks were destined to become a great seafaring people, but sea trade was a business which it took them many ages to learn. After they had reached the coast of the Aegean, it was long before they could step into the place of the old sea kings of Crete. For several centuries after the Trojan War, the trade of the Aegean with the East was partly carried on by strangers. The men who took advantage of this opening were the traders of the city-states of Sidon and Tyre on the Syrian coast, men of that Semitic stock to which Jew, Arab, and Assyrian alike belonged. These coastlanders, born merchants like the Jews, seem to have migrated to the shores of the Mediterranean from an older home on the shores of the Red Sea. The Greeks knew these bronze Semitic traders by the same name, Phoenices, or Red Men, which they had before applied to the Cretans. This led to some confusion in their traditions. We have seen how the Cretan Cadmus and Europa were transferred to Phoenicia in the legend. We have no warrant for speaking of a Phoenician sea lordship in the Aegean. The evidence of the Homeric poems shows clearly that between the commercial enterprise of the heroic age and the commercial enterprise of the later Greeks there was an interval of perhaps 200 years or thereabouts, during which no Greek state possessed a sea power strong enough to exclude foreign merchants from the Greek seas, and trade was consequently shared by Greek and Tyrian merchants. It was not only Phoenician carriers who came to Greece. The Greeks also sailed to Syria and Cyprus, and the Carians developed a considerable sea power. We shall see in the next chapter how the men of Tyre and Sidon made a new Phoenicia in the western Mediterranean, but on the shores of the Aegean they seem to have made no serious attempts, or at least to have succeeded in no attempts, to plant permanent settlements except at Camyrus in Rhodes, and possibly in the island of Cythera. It may be that they had stations at the purple fisheries of Kos and Nisyros and Erythrae and elsewhere. It has been supposed that they were the first to tap the gold mines of Sifnos and Thassos, and even the silver mines of Attica. It has been held that there were Phoenician settlements on the Isthmus of Corinth, under the Acropolis of Athens, and even at inland Thebes. There is no assurance or possibility that such settlements were ever made. The Phoenicians doubtless had marts here and there on coast or island, but there is no reason to think that Canaanites ever made homes for themselves on Greek soil or introduced Semitic blood into the population of Greece. It was not here that the struggle was to be fought out between Baal and Zeus. Their ships were ever winding in and out of the Aegean seas from south to north, bearing fair naperies from Syria, fine wrought bowls and cups from the workshops of Sidonian and Cypriot silversmiths, and all manner of luxuries and ornaments. And this constant commercial intercourse, lasting for 2 centuries, is amply sufficient to account for all the influence that Phoenicia exerted upon Greece. In the worship of Aphrodite and other Greek goddesses we see the influence of the cult of Syrian Astarte, and the Phoenician god Melkart was not only taken into Greek mythology under the name of Melikertes, but was identified in many places with the Greek god Heracles. The briskest trade was perhaps driven with the thriving cities of Ionia, and the Phoenicians adopted the Ionian name and diffused it in Syria as the general designation of all the Greeks. These things were of slight concern compared with one inestimable service which the Phoenicians rendered to Hellas and thereby to Europe. They gave the Greeks the most useful instrument of civilization, alphabetic writing. It was perhaps at the beginning of the 9th century, hardly later, that the Phoenician alphabet was moulded to the needs of the Greek language. In this adaptation the Greeks showed their genius. The alphabet of the Phoenicians and their Semitic brethren is an alphabet of consonants. The Greeks added the vowels. They took some of the consonantal symbols, for which their own language had no corresponding sounds, and used these superfluous signs to represent the vowels. Several alphabets, differing in certain details, were diffused in various parts of the Hellenic world, but they all agree in the main points, and we may suppose that the original idea was worked out in Ionia. In Ionia, at all events, writing was introduced at an early period, and was perhaps used by poets of the 9th century. Perhaps the earliest example of a Greek writing that we possess is on an Attic jar of the 7th century. It says the jar shall be the prize of the dancer who dances more gaily than all others. But the lack of early inscriptions is what we should expect. The new art was used for ordinary and literary purposes long before it was employed for official records. It was the gift which the Semites gave to Europe. Section 11. Greek reconstruction of early Greek history. We must now see what the Greeks thought of their own early history. Their construction of it, though founded on legendary tradition and framed without much historical sense, has considerable importance, since their ideas about the past affected their views of the present. Their belief in their legendary past was thoroughly practical. Mythic events were often the basis of diplomatic transactions. Claims to territory might be founded on the supposed conquests or dominions of ancient heroes of divine birth. At first, before the growth of historical curiosity, the chief motive for investigating the past was the desire of noble families to derive their origin from a god. For this purpose they sought to connect their pedigrees with heroic ancestors, especially with Heracles or with the warriors who had fought at Troy. The Trojan War was, with some reason, regarded as a national enterprise, and Heracles, who seems originally to have been specially associated with Argolis, was looked on as a national hero. The consequence was that the Greeks framed their history on genealogies and determined their chronology by generations, reckoning 3 generations to 100 years. The later Homeric poets must have contributed a great deal to the fixing of the mutual relations of legendary events, but it was the poets of the school of Hesiod in the 7th century who did most to reduce to a historical system the legends of the heroic age. Their poems are lost, but they were worked up into still more complete and elaborate schemes by the prose logographers or story writers of the 6th and 5th centuries, of whom perhaps the most influential were Hecataeus of Miletus and Acusilaus of Argos. The original works of the logographers have also perished, but their teaching has come down to us fully enough in the works of later compilers and commentators. In the first place, it had to be determined how the various branches of the Greek race were related. As soon as the Greeks came to be called by the common name of Hellenes, they derived their whole stock from an eponymous ancestor, Hellene, who lived in Thessaly. They had then to account for its distribution into a number of different branches. In Greece proper they might have searched long among the various folks speaking various idioms for some principle of classification which should determine the nearer and further degrees of kinship between the divisions of the race, and establish 2 or 3 original branches to which every community could trace itself back. But when they looked over to the eastern Greece on the farther side of the Aegean, they saw, as it were, a reflection of themselves, their own children, divided into 3 homogeneous groups, Aeolians, Ionians, and Dorians. This gave a simple classification: 3 families sprung from Aeolus, Ion, and Dorus, who must evidently have been the sons of Hellene. But there was one difficulty. Homer's Achaeans had still to be accounted for. They could not be affiliated to Aeolians or Ionians or Dorians, none of whom play a part in the Iliad. Accordingly, it was arranged that Hellene had 3 sons, Aeolus, Dorus, and Xuthus, and Ion and Echeus were the sons of Xuthus. It was easy enough then, by the help of tradition and language, to fit the ethnography of Greece under these labels, and the manifold dialects were forced under 3 artificial divisions. The 2 great events, on which everything turned, and to which all other events were related, were the Trojan War and the Dorian conquest of the Peloponnesus. A most curious version of the Dorian conquest was invented in Argos, and won its way into general belief. It is a striking illustration of the motives and methods of the Greeks in reconstructing their past. The Temenids, the royal family of Argos, derived themselves from Aegimeus, to whom the foundation of the Dorian institutions were ascribed. But as the fame and glory of Heracles waxed great, the Temenids desired to connect themselves with him. The problem was solved with wonderful skill. The eponymous ancestors of the 3 Dorian tribes, Helus, Pamphilus, and Demon, were naturally regarded as the sons of Aegimeus. According to the new story, Helus was really the son of Heracles. It was said that Heracles fought against the Lapiths for Aegimeus, who was a Dorian king in Thessaly, and that he received 1/3 of the kingdom as a reward for his valiant service. On his death his children were protected by Aegimeus, who adopted Helus and confirmed him in the possession of his father's 1/3. The sons of Helus failed in their attempts to recover the possessions of Heracles in the Peloponnesus. The achievement was reserved for his great-grandchildren, Temenus, Cresphontes, and Aristodemus. With a Dorian host they crossed from Naupactus under the guidance of a one-eyed Aetolian man named Oxylus, and conquered all the Peloponnesus except Arcadia. They gave Elis to Oxylus for his pains. Those of the Achaean inhabitants of the peninsula, who did not migrate beyond the sea, retreated to the northern coastland, the historical Achaia. The other 3 parts of the Peloponnesus fell by lot to the 3 brothers, Messenia to Cresphontes, Laconia to Aristodemus, and Argos to Temenus. An explanation was added how there were 2 royal houses at Sparta. Aristodemus died prematurely, and Laconia was divided between his twin sons, Eurysthenes and Procles. Thus the Dorian invasion was justified as a recovery of usurped rights, and the royal houses of Argos and Sparta renounced their Dorian origin and connected themselves by blood with Heracles, who was associated with the pre-Dorian lords of Argolis. Every place in Greece had its own local legends, which grew up quite independently. Sometimes they were adapted and modified to suit the legendary scheme of the poets and story-writers, but often they lived on, unscrupulously accepted notwithstanding all incompatibilities. In several cases we find, in the poems of Homer and Hesiod, legends which are inconsistent with those which became currently accepted. Thus Cadmus was the founder of Thebes, according to the current legend, but in the Odyssey Thebes is built by Amphion and Zethus. The origin of Corinth was traced on one hand to Ephir, the daughter of Ocean, on the other to Sisyphus, the son of Aeolus. The received genealogy of pre-Dorian Argos had no connection with Hellene and his sons. Argos derived its origin from Inachus, a personification of the stream of Inachus which flows by the town, who, like most rivers, was regarded as a son of Ocean. Argos was his great-grandson. Io, from whom the Danaoi were descended, was his daughter. Thus it emerges that the pre-Dorian Argives were not Hellenes, for they were not derived from Hellene. If the legend had been true to history, they should have been traced from Ion, as there was probably a large Ionian element in Argolis. But for most of the Greeks, connections with Hellene and his sons were manufactured. It was to Aeolus, that most descents were traced. He had 7 sons and 5 daughters, and it was not difficult to work out more or less plausible connections. Aetolian legends fastened themselves on to his daughter Callike. His son Sisyphus founded Corinth. The Thessalian heroes Admetus and Jason were derived from another son, Cretheus. Perhaps the most interesting instance is the genealogy which was established for the Codrid families of Miletus and other cities of Ionia. They traced up their lineage to Poseidon, and at the same time derived themselves from Hellene. The story was that Salmoneus, son of Aeolus, had a daughter who bore to Poseidon twin sons, Peleus and Neleus. As Peleus won the Thessalian kingdom of Iolcus, Neleus went forth from the land and founded a kingdom for himself at Pylos, in the southwest of the Peloponnesus. He was succeeded by Nestor, who in his old age bore a part in the Trojan War. Nestor's 4th successor, Melanthus, was a ruler of Pylos, when the Dorians came down into the Peloponnesus, and he retreated before their attack to Athens, where he became king and was the father of Codrus. Then Neleus, a son of Codrus, led the Ionian migration to Asia Minor. Thus, a number of different traditions were wrought into a narrative, which, originating in Ionia, was accepted in Attica and influenced the ideas of the Athenians about a part of their own early history. The Greeks were not content that their legends should be confined to the range of their own country and their own race, and in curious contrast with that exclusive pride which drew a hard and fast line between Greek and barbarian, they brought their ancestors and their myths in connection with foreign lands. Thus the myth of Io made the Danaoi of Argos cousins of the Egyptians. By her amour with Zeus, Io became the grandmother of Danaus and Aegyptus, the eponymous ancestors of the two peoples. Cadmus, the namesire of the Cadmeans of Thebes, was represented as a Phoenician, who went forth from his own land in quest of his sister Europa, and settled in Boeotia. The tale which gained widest belief made Pelops son of the Phrygian Tantalus, king of Sipylus, whence he migrated to the Peloponnesus and founded the royal line of Argos, from which Agamemnon was sprung. A Corinthian legend brought the early history of Corinth into connection with Colchis, representing Aeetes, offspring of the sun, as the first Corinthian king, and his daughter Medea as heiress to the land. The true home of the Greeks before they won dominion in Greece had passed clean out of their remembrance, and they looked to the east, not to the north, as the quarter from which some of their ancestors had migrated. Of the legends which won sincere credence among the Greeks, and assumed, as we may say, a national significance, none is more curious or more obscure in its origin than that of the Amazons, a folk of warrior women, strong and brave, living apart from men, were conceived to have dwelt in Asia in the heroic age, and proved themselves worthy foes of the Greek heroes. An obvious etymology of their name, breastless, suggests the belief that they used to burn off the right breast that they might the better draw the bow. In the Iliad, Priam tells how he fought against their army in Phrygia, and one of the perilous tasks which are set to Bellerophon is to march against the Amazons. In a later Homeric poem, the Amazon Penthesilea appears as the dreaded adversary of the Greeks at Troy. To win the girdle of the Amazon queen was one of the labours of Heracles. All these adventures happened in Asia Minor, and, though this female folk was located in various places, its original and proper home was ultimately placed on the river Thermodon near the Greek colony of Amisus. But the Amazons attacked Greece itself. It was told that Theseus carried off their queen Antiope, and so they came and invaded Attica. There was a terrible battle in the town of Athens, and the invaders were defeated after a long struggle, At the feast of Theseus, the Athenians used to sacrifice to the Amazons. There was a building called the Amazoneon in the western quarter of the city, and the episode was believed by such men as Isocrates and Plato to be as truly an historical fact as the Trojan War itself. The battles of Greeks with Amazons were a favourite subject of Grecian sculptures, and, like the Trojan War and the adventures of the Golden Fleece, the Amazon story fitted into the conception of an ancient and long strife between Greece and Asia. The details of the famous legends, the labours of Heracles, the Trojan War, the voyage of the Argonauts, the tale of Cadmus, the life of Oedipus, the 2 sieges of Thebes by the Argive Adrastus, and all the other familiar stories belong to the mythology and lie beyond our present scope. But we have to realize that the later Greeks believed them and discussed them as sober history, and that many of them had a genuine historical basis, however slender. The story of the Trojan War has more historical matter in it than any other, but we have seen that the Argonautic legend and the tale of Cadmus contain dim memories of actual events. It is quite probable that the heroic age witnessed rivalry and war between Thebes and Argos. 2 powerful generating forces of these historic myths had been the custom of families and cities to trace their origin to a god, and the instinct of the Greeks to personify places, especially towns, rivers and springs. Then, when men began both to become keenly conscious of a community of race and language, and to speculate upon the past, attempts were naturally made to bring the various myths of Greece into harmony. Since they were true, they must be reconciled. Ultimately, they were reduced into chronological systems, which were based upon genealogical reckonings by generations. Hecataeus of Miletus counted a generation as 40 years, but it was more usual to reckon 3 generations to 100 years. According to the scheme which finally won the widest acceptance, Troy was taken in 1184 BC, and the Dorians invaded the Peloponnesus under the leadership of the Heraclids in 1104 BC. And both these dates accord more closely than one might expect, considering the method by which they were obtained with the general probabilities of the case. Leading dates according to the system of Eratosthenes, circa 220 BC. Cadmus, 1313 BC. Pelops, 1283 BC. Heracles, 1261 to 1209. Argonauts, 1225. 7 against Thebes, 1213. Fall of Troy, 1184. Thessalian conquest and Boeotian and Aeolic migration, 1124 BC. Return of Heraclidae, 1104 BC. Death of Codrus, 1044. Ionic migration, 1044. Lycurgus at Sparta, 885. End of chapter 1, part 11.